Hello, everyone. Tonight we begin with the aching cold, the smoky stillness, and the slow, stubborn rhythm of a Viking winter. Imagine spending half the year in near darkness, wrapped in damp wool, with nothing to do but mend old tools and wait for salted fish to thaw just enough to chew. The air inside is thick with the scent of wood smoke and wet fur. Your joints ache. The fire smokes more than it warms. And the silence is only broken by the occasional cough, the low murmur of tired voices, a creaking roof beam, or the sound of a wooden spoon scraping the last bit of porridge from a cracked clay bowl. Outside, the snow piles higher by the day. The livestock huddle in corners. The wind pushes against the longhouse walls with the patience of something that knows it has months to wear you down. Inside, time moves strangely. Hours stretch, days blend. The mind drifts to stories, to memories, to whatever warmth it can find. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always comforting to see how far this quiet circle reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. It begins not with a raid, but with a sigh. Imagine yourself in a longhouse. It's late December in what is now western Norway, and the sky has been dark since mid-afternoon. The air inside the building smells of damp wool, old smoke, salted meat, and stale ale. You sit on a raised wooden platform, covered in sheepskins that don't quite mask the chill. Wind slips through the narrow wooden planks in the walls. Your joints ache not from old age, but from the constant cold that seeps in like a second skeleton. You are not out exploring the world or writing heroic verses. You are waiting for daylight, waiting for spring, waiting for something, anything to happen. The longhouse stretches before you like a cavern of survival, its curved walls rising to meet overhead beams blackened by countless seasons of smoke. The structure itself is a testament to pragmatic architecture born from necessity. Massive oak posts anchor the building to the earth, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands seeking support in the perpetual gloom. Between these pillars, families have carved out territories marked by hanging cloth partitions and personal belongings stacked along the walls. Privacy is a luxury that winter cannot afford. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, hardened by time and footsteps, covered in places by wooden planks that creak with every movement. Straw has been scattered across the walkways, but it's old now, compressed and dirty, mixed with the detritus of daily life. Children's wooden toys lie abandoned in corners. Broken pottery waits for repair. Everything bears the patina of confinement, of too many people living too closely together for too long. Viking winters weren't just cold. They were slow. They were hungry. They were boring. The sagas don't tell you this part. They're too busy recounting raids, revenge plots, and dramatic oaths. But for the vast majority of Norse people, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, fisherfolk, winter was less about violence and more about endurance. It was about the grinding patience required to survive months when the world itself seemed to have stopped breathing. The romanticized image of Vikings that echoes through popular culture focuses on the brief, explosive moments of their lives, the longships cutting through storm-tossed seas, the gleam of weapons in the heat of battle, the proud declarations of warriors facing their doom. But these moments were punctuation marks in longer sentences of ordinary existence, and winter was when those sentences stretched into paragraphs of monotonous survival. Consider the mathematics of darkness. In the depths of a Norwegian winter, the sun might rise at 10 in the morning, if you could call the weak gray light that filtered through heavy clouds a sunrise. By 3 in the afternoon, it would be setting again, leaving behind a twilight that wasn't quite day and wasn't quite night. This wasn't the clean darkness of a summer evening, which arrives after a full day of productivity and warmth. This was a premature death of light, a daily reminder that the world had turned away from you. The days were short, sometimes no longer than 5 hours of light. Not sunlight, mind you, just light. A dull gray twilight that barely illuminated the packed snow. And when the wind howled off the North Atlantic, you didn't go outside unless you absolutely had to. The livestock needed feeding, and the outhouse, well, you didn't linger. That wind was a character in the winter drama, as constant and unpredictable as a moody god. It would start as a whisper, barely noticeable as it found the gaps in the longhouse walls. Then it would grow, rattling the wooden shutters, making the flames in the central hearth dance and flicker. When it reached full fury, it became a howling presence that seemed to surround the entire building, probing for weaknesses, seeking entry. The sound penetrated everything, making conversation difficult and sleep fitful. People learned to read the wind's moods, to predict when it would subside enough to venture outside for essential tasks. The livestock required daily attention, regardless of weather conditions. Cows needed milking, though their production dropped dramatically in winter. Goats had to be fed and watered. Chickens, if they survived the cold, huddled together in whatever sheltered spaces could be found. These animals weren't just sources of food and materials. They were investments in the future, repositories of hope for the spring that would surely come. Losing livestock to cold, disease, or starvation meant facing the next year with fewer resources, less security, and diminished prospects for prosperity. The outhouse visits were exercises in endurance that broke the monotony of indoor confinement while testing the limits of human tolerance for discomfort. Bundled in whatever clothing could be quickly thrown on, you would push through the longhouse door into air so cold it burned your lungs. The path to the latrine might be buried under snow that had been walked down by previous visits, creating an icy trail that offered treacherous footing in the darkness. The structure itself provided minimal shelter from the wind, and lingering meant risking frostbite to exposed skin. These were transactions with necessity, completed as quickly as possible before retreating to the relative warmth of the longhouse. Inside the longhouse, families huddled together, often with the animals. Cows, goats, maybe even a few chickens, not because it was cozy, but because their body heat helped keep the space barely tolerable. There were no chimneys, so smoke from the central hearth pooled beneath the rafters, stinging eyes and blackening the beams over time. Coughing was constant, so were minor burns. The fire was always there, never bright enough, always threatening to go out. The presence of animals inside human living spaces created a complex ecosystem of survival. The cattle section of the longhouse, separated from the human areas by low wooden barriers, generated precious warmth through the animals' metabolism. Their breathing added humidity to air that would otherwise be desert dry. Their body heat radiated outward, creating microclimates of relative comfort near their stalls. But they also brought the challenges of animal husbandry indoors. Manure had to be managed, animal waste had to be cleaned regularly, and the smell, while tolerable through necessity, permeated every aspect of daily life. The chickens, if they were lucky enough to survive the transition from outdoor coops to indoor shelter, would roost wherever they could find safety from the larger animals and human traffic. They provided occasional eggs, though laying dropped significantly in the cold and dark. More importantly, they offered the promise of eggs when spring returned and their reproductive cycles resumed. Children might play with the more docile birds, finding companionship in creatures that were neither predator nor competitor. The central hearth dominated the social and practical life of the winter longhouse. Fed with whatever fuel could be gathered or had been stockpiled, it provided the only reliable source of heat and light. Wood was the preferred fuel, but in regions where trees were scarce, people burned peat, dried manure, or even bones. The fire required constant attention. Someone always had to be responsible for keeping it alive, for adding fuel, for banking the coals at night so that flames could be rekindled in the morning. Without chimneys, the smoke had nowhere to go but up, where it would collect under the peaked roof before slowly finding its way out through gaps in the construction. This created a permanent haze that hung over everything, stinging eyes and coating surfaces with a fine layer of soot. People's clothing, hair, and skin carried the smell of smoke constantly. The beams overhead grew darker each year, accumulating layers of residue that spoke to decades of winter fires. Burns were inevitable. Sparks would pop from the fire, landing on clothing, skin, or bedding. People would lean too close while cooking or warming themselves, singeing hair or clothing. Children, drawn to the warmth and light, had to be watched constantly to prevent serious accidents. These minor injuries were treated with whatever remedies were available. Poultices made from herbs preserved from the summer, or simply endured until they healed on their own. The threat of the fire going out completely hung over the household like a curse. Without matches or easy ways to create flame, rekindling a dead fire meant borrowing coals from neighbors, if any were close enough and accessible, or the laborious process of creating fire through friction or flint and steel. A dead fire in the depths of winter could mean death for the entire household. Someone always slept lightly, ready to tend the flames if they began to die down during the night. Food was repetitive. Salted fish, dried meat, and porridge made from barley or rye. If the preserves didn't hold, or mold crept in during a thaw, you ate less. Maybe you dipped into the reserves of fermented herring, a dish that even Vikings seemed to regard with suspicion. Root vegetables, if any, were mushy and bland. There were no spices, save salt, and sometimes not even that. You drank weak beer because water wasn't safe. And every meal tasted like whatever it had been stored in animal bladder, clay, or pine wood barrels. The preservation of food for winter consumption was both science and art, passed down through generations of trial and error. Salting drew moisture from fish and meat, creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that caused rot. But the process required salt, which might be available from coastal regions, or had to be traded from distant sources. The quality of preservation depended on the skill of the person doing the work, the quality of the salt, and the conditions under which the food was stored. Dried meat, or jerky, represented another strategy for extending the usable life of protein. Strips of flesh from cattle, sheep, goats, or wild game were hung in areas with good air circulation, allowing moisture to evaporate while the meat retained its nutritional value. The texture became leather-like, requiring long chewing or rehydration in soups and stews. The flavor concentrated and changed, becoming more intense but also more monotonous over time. Fermented fish, particularly herring, offered a way to preserve protein while creating something that approached variety in the winter diet. The fermentation process, while producing food that was safe to eat and nutritionally dense, also created flavors and odors that challenged even accustomed palates. These preserved fish were often the difference between survival and starvation, but they were rarely enjoyed. They were endured, consumed out of necessity rather than pleasure. Grains stored from the harvest formed the foundation of many winter meals. Barley and rye could be ground into flour for bread, though the bread made in winter was often dense and coarse, lacking the fresh ingredients that made summer baking more palatable. More commonly, grains were boiled into porridge, a thick, filling meal that could be stretched with water or milk when supplies ran low. The porridge provided calories and basic nutrition, but its monotonous texture and flavor made it the epitome of survival eating. Root vegetables, when they were available, had often spent months in root cellars or storage pits. By midwinter, potatoes, turnips, and carrots had lost much of their firmness and flavor. They became soft, sometimes slightly sweet from the conversion of starches to sugars in cold storage, but their texture was mushy and unappealing. Still, they provided variety and essential nutrients that helped prevent deficiency diseases. A lack of spices and seasonings meant that every meal tasted fundamentally similar. Salt, when available, was precious and used sparingly. Herbs preserved from summer might add occasional flavor, but dried herbs lost much of their potency over the long winter months. The result was a diet that, while adequate for survival, offered little pleasure or variety. Food became fuel rather than enjoyment, consumed for its necessity rather than its taste. Water safety was a constant concern. In winter, natural water sources might freeze, become contaminated, or be difficult to access. Wells could freeze solid, requiring the laborious process of breaking ice or melting snow for water. But even when liquid water was available, it might carry diseases or parasites that could prove fatal, especially to children or elderly people whose resistance was already compromised by cold and marginal nutrition. Beer, even weak beer, offered a safer alternative. The brewing process killed many harmful microorganisms, and the alcohol content, however slight, provided additional protection against contamination. The beer consumed during winter was often thin and barely alcoholic, more like flavored water than the stronger brews associated with celebrations. But it was safe to drink and provided calories that pure water could not offer. Storage containers imparted their own flavors to everything they held. Clay pots might give food an earthy taste. Wooden barrels flavored contents with whatever wood had been used in their construction. Animal bladders, used as waterproof containers, added their own distinctive notes to stored foods. After months of storage, everything began to taste like its container, creating a uniformity of flavor that made meals even more monotonous. So what did people do all winter? There's no clear answer, but a lot of time was spent waiting. Children played with carved toys, if they had them. Adults repaired tools or mended clothing, some carved. Others spun wool, braided ropes, or sang quietly. Storytelling passed the time, often around the fire, with sagas that were already generations old, half-remembered tales of gods, giants, and glories that felt very far from the muddy slush underfoot. The question of how to fill the long hours of winter darkness was one that every household had to answer according to their resources and traditions. With no artificial lighting beyond the fire, productive work had to be done during the brief daylight hours or close to the hearth where flames provided illumination. This meant that many activities were communal by necessity, bringing families together around the central fire where light and warmth made work possible. Children's toys were simple affairs, carved from wood by fathers or uncles who had time and skill with knives. Wooden horses, crude dolls, simple boats, and spinning tops provided entertainment and helped develop coordination and imagination. But these toys were luxuries that not every family could afford to create or maintain. More often, children played games that required no equipment, games of memory, singing, or physical contests that could be conducted in the limited space of the longhouse. For adults, winter was the season of maintenance and preparation. Tools that had been damaged or worn during the active seasons needed repair. Axe handles had to be replaced, blade edges restored through careful grinding and sharpening. Leather goods required attention, oil, and conditioning to keep them flexible and waterproof. These tasks required skill and time, both of which winter provided in abundance. Textile work occupied much of the winter hours for women, and some men skilled in these crafts. Wool had to be cleaned, combed, and spun into thread. The spinning wheel, where available, provided both productive work and a rhythmic activity that could be performed while socializing or listening to stories. Thread had to be woven into cloth using looms that might take up significant space in the longhouse. The quality of textile work done during winter months would determine the adequacy of clothing and bedding for the coming year. Rope making was another essential winter activity. Ropes were needed for everything from securing loads to rigging ships to binding construction materials. The process of braiding rope from plant fibers or animal hair was time-consuming, but could be done by multiple people working together, making it a social activity as well as a productive one. Carving provided both practical and artistic outlets. Wooden bowls, spoons, and other household implements needed regular replacement. Decorative carving on these utilitarian objects offered a way to express creativity and skill while producing necessary items. Some carvers specialized in more elaborate work, creating decorated posts, furniture, or ceremonial objects that would last for generations. The tradition of storytelling grew from the necessity of passing time and the human need for narrative and meaning. The sagas that were recounted during winter evenings were repositories of cultural memory, containing historical information, moral lessons, and entertainment, all woven together. These stories were not fixed texts, but living narratives that changed with each telling, adapted to the audience and the circumstances of the moment. The stories themselves often dealt with themes that resonated with winter audiences. Tales of heroic endurance, of surviving against impossible odds, of wading through long periods of hardship before achieving triumph. The gods and heroes of these sagas faced challenges that mirrored the experiences of the people listening to their stories, though magnified to mythic proportions. Odin's sacrifices, Thor's struggles against the forces of chaos, clever solutions of Loki in difficult situations, all provided models for understanding and enduring the challenges of winter survival. But the sagas also offered escape from immediate circumstances. They transported listeners to worlds of adventure and excitement, the places where individual actions had cosmic consequences, where heroes could change the fate of gods and giants through courage and cunning. For people trapped in longhouses, facing months of routine survival, these stories provided mental travel to landscapes of possibility and drama. The half-remembered nature of many tales added to their appeal. Details might be disputed, versions compared, missing elements supplied through collective memory or individual creativity. This made storytelling interactive, engaging the entire audience in the creative process. Children learned by listening and eventually by attempting to tell stories themselves, ensuring the continuation of cultural traditions. Isolation added to the stillness. Farms were spaced out. Travel in winter was possible, but unpleasant. Sleds, not wagons, pulled over snow. Neighbors might visit, but only when necessary. Social gatherings were rare until Yule. A midwinter feast meant to cheer spirits and honor ancestors. Even then, supplies had to be carefully rationed. The celebrations were likely subdued, not rowdy. People couldn't afford to be too generous with what little they had. The scattered nature of Norse settlements meant that most families spent winter months with only their immediate household for company. Farms might be separated by miles of difficult terrain, distances that became nearly impossible to traverse safely during the worst weather. This isolation was both practical and psychological, cutting people off from the broader community just when social contact might be most beneficial for mental health and morale. Winter travel, when absolutely necessary, required specialized equipment and considerable risk. Sleds replaced wheeled vehicles, and these had to be loaded carefully to maintain balance on uneven, snow-covered terrain. The runners had to be maintained and repaired, and the pulling animals, usually oxen or horses, needed extra care and feeding to maintain their strength for the demanding work of hauling loads through snow and ice. The paths between settlements, clear and well-traveled during warmer months, became treacherous obstacle courses in winter. Snow might hide holes, rocks, or fallen trees. Ice could make footing uncertain for both humans and animals. Storms could arise quickly, turning a routine journey into a life-threatening situation. Travelers had to carry extra clothing, food, and fuel, adding weight to their loads and reducing the speed of travel. Most winter journeys were motivated by genuine emergencies. Medical crises that required specialized knowledge or treatment. Deaths that necessitated notification of distant relatives. Serious accidents or equipment failures that required assistance beyond what a single household could provide. Social visits for their own sake were luxuries that few could afford, given the risks and effort involved in winter travel. The anticipation of Yule provided a focal point for winter endurance, a celebration that marked the turning of the year and offered hope for the return of longer days. But even this major festival had to be approached with caution and careful planning. The supplies needed for feasting had to be balanced against the resources needed to survive the remainder of winter. Hospitality was an important cultural value, but it had to be measured against practical limitations. Yule celebrations were likely more intimate and restrained than the elaborate feasts described in some historical accounts. Families might share special foods that had been saved for the occasion, ale or mead that had been carefully preserved, and perhaps some fresh meat if an animal could be slaughtered without compromising the household's future security. The emphasis was on marking the significance of the season rather than on extravagant consumption. Gift-giving during Yule focused on practical items that would be useful during the remainder of winter or in preparation for spring. New clothing, improved tools, or useful household items were more common than decorative or luxury goods. The gifts themselves were often handmade during the winter months, representing not just material value, but the investment of time and skill by the giver. The cold itself was punishing, not in sudden bursts, but in the way it never quite left. You might warm your fingers by the fire, only for them to go numb again a few minutes later. Clothing was made of wool and fur, but once it was wet, it stayed wet for days. Boots were stuffed with straw or moss, and feet often ached for hours afterward. Children especially suffered, not always from starvation, but from a lack of stimulation, from respiratory illnesses, or just from relentless discomfort. The persistent nature of winter cold was perhaps its most challenging aspect. Unlike the dramatic cold of a blizzard, which demanded immediate action and attention, the steady cold of a Norse winter was a constant background presence that affected every aspect of daily life. It was the cold that made simple tasks more difficult, that sapped energy and enthusiasm, that created a persistent state of mild discomfort that colored every experience. The warming effects of the central fire were limited and temporary. Heat radiated outward from the flames, creating zones of relative comfort that diminished rapidly with distance. A person might warm their hands and face by holding them close to the fire, feeling genuine relief and comfort. But stepping back even a few feet meant returning to the ambient temperature of the longhouse, which, while warmer than the outside air, was still cold enough to be uncomfortable. This cycle of warming and cooling became a rhythm of winter life. People would rotate positions around the fire, taking turns in the warmest spots, sharing access to heat as a communal resource. The spaces closest to the fire were often reserved for the youngest children, the elderly, or anyone who was ill, while healthy adults worked and lived in the cooler areas of the longhouse. Clothing in winter was a matter of layering and adaptation rather than specialized winter garments. Wool was the primary material for most people, providing insulation even when damp and retaining body heat reasonably well. But wool clothing had its limitations. It was heavy when wet, slow to dry, and could become stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. Fur, when available, provided better insulation and water resistance. But good furs were expensive and not accessible to everyone. The problem of wet clothing was particularly challenging. In the confined space of the longhouse, with cooking, breathing, and the presence of animals creating humidity, clothing could become damp even without direct contact with water or snow. Once wet, woolen garments might take days to dry completely, especially in the low temperatures and high humidity of winter living spaces. Wearing damp clothing was uncomfortable and could lead to health problems, but there was often no alternative. Footwear presented special challenges in winter conditions. Boots or shoes had to provide insulation, protection from moisture, and traction on slippery surfaces. The soles were often made of thick leather, but leather could become hard and inflexible in extreme cold. To provide additional insulation, people stuffed their footwear with straw, moss, or other organic materials that trapped air and provided a barrier between their feet and the cold ground. But these improvised insoles had their own problems. Straw and moss could become compressed and lose their insulating properties. They could become damp from perspiration or moisture penetration, creating cold, wet conditions inside the boots. The materials had to be changed regularly, requiring a constant supply of dry stuffing material that might not always be available. Children faced particular hardships during winter months. Their smaller body mass made them more susceptible to cold, and their higher metabolic rates meant they needed more food relative to their size to maintain body temperature. But they were also more resilient in some ways, adapting to conditions that might be debilitating for adults and finding entertainment and interest in circumstances that older people found merely tedious. The lack of stimulation and activity could be particularly hard on children. During warmer months, they could play outside, explore their environment, and engage in physical activities that promoted healthy development. Winter confined them to the limited space of the longhouse, restricting their movement and reducing the variety of experiences available to them. This could lead to behavioral problems, conflicts with siblings and parents, and a general restlessness that added to the stress of winter living. Respiratory illnesses were common during winter months, particularly among children. The combination of cold air, smoke from the central fire, close quarters with other people and animals, and reduced nutrition created conditions favorable to the spread of infections. Coughing, runny noses, and more serious respiratory conditions were routine parts of winter life. Without effective medical treatments, these illnesses had to run their course, while families hoped they would not develop into more serious conditions. The discomfort of winter living was relentless and pervasive. It wasn't just the cold, but the combination of cold, dampness, poor air quality, limited movement, monotonous food, and social confinement that created a general state of physical and psychological stress. People adapted to these conditions through necessity, but the adaptation came at a cost in terms of health, comfort, and well-being. Even time itself seemed to slow. Without clocks or structured calendars, days bled into one another. The only markers were household chores, feast days, or shifts in the sky. The return of longer days in late February or March must have felt like a gift, a turning point after weeks of sameness. The perception of time during winter was profoundly different from modern experience. Without artificial lighting, human activity was constrained by the natural rhythms of daylight and darkness. When daylight lasted only 5 hours, and much of that was a dim gray twilight, the boundary between day and night became blurred. Time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably, with long periods of darkness feeling endless, while brief moments of activity passed quickly. The lack of mechanical timekeeping meant that people measured time through natural and social markers rather than precise intervals. The routine of daily chores provided structure, feeding animals in the morning, tending the fire throughout the day, preparing meals at traditional times. But these activities were flexible, adjusted to circumstances and availability of light rather than rigidly scheduled. Feast days and religious observances served as temporal landmarks, breaking the winter into manageable segments and providing goals to anticipate. The approach of Yule gave structure to the darkest part of winter, while other traditional celebrations marked the slow progression toward spring. These observances were not just social and religious events, but psychological necessities, providing meaning and anticipation that helped people endure the monotony of winter survival. The gradual lengthening of days in late winter was probably the most eagerly anticipated change of the season. Each day brought a few more minutes of light, imperceptible at first, but gradually becoming noticeable. The return of longer daylight hours represented not just the promise of spring, but the immediate possibility of increased activity, more productive work, and relief from the psychological oppression of constant darkness. Weather patterns provided another way of marking time. though not necessarily a reliable one. The arrival of storms, brief thaws, periods of extreme cold, and other weather events created memorable markers that helped distinguish one day or week from another. People became expert at reading natural signs, not just for practical reasons like predicting when travel might be possible, but as a way of maintaining their sense of temporal progression through the winter months. And yet, somehow, people found rhythm in the hardship. The beat of the loom, the crackle of fire, the sighs of wind against wooden walls. These were the sounds of survival, of time passing however slowly, of life held together not by adventure, but by patience. The rhythms of winter life, while constrained and repetitive, developed their own musicality and meaning. The regular sounds of daily activities created a soundtrack of endurance that provided comfort through familiarity. The steady beating of looms as thread was woven into cloth became a percussive background to conversation and thought. The sound was productive and hopeful, representing progress toward the clothing and household goods that would be needed in the coming year. The crackling of fire was perhaps the most important sound in the winter longhouse, representing warmth, light, security, and the continuation of life itself. People became sensitive to the subtle variations in fire sounds, able to distinguish between the cheerful crackling of a well-fed fire and the concerning whispers of flames that needed attention. The sound of fire was companionship in the long darkness, a voice that spoke of human control over hostile natural forces. The wind provided a constantly changing acoustic environment, from gentle whispers that barely registered in consciousness to howling storms that dominated all conversation and activity. People learned to interpret wind sounds as indicators of weather conditions, safety for outdoor activities, and the general state of their environment. The wind became a character in the winter drama, sometimes threatening, sometimes merely present, always unpredictable. These sounds, along with the human sounds of conversation, children playing, animals moving, and tools being used, created the acoustic landscape of winter survival. They were not the dramatic sounds of battle or adventure celebrated in the sagas, but they were the sounds of life continuing against odds of human persistence in the face of natural challenges, of communities holding together through shared hardship. The patience required for winter survival was perhaps the most underappreciated virtue of Norse culture. This was not the dramatic patience of a hero, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, but the mundane patience of ordinary people, enduring months of discomfort, monotony, and uncertainty. It was the patience of parents managing confined children, of couples sharing cramped quarters, of communities stretching limited resources across endless weeks of cold and darkness. This patience was learned and taught, passed from generation to generation as an essential survival skill. Children who grew up in this environment learned not just the practical skills of winter survival, but the psychological and social skills needed to maintain sanity and relationships under stress. They learned to find entertainment in simple activities, to contribute to household survival according to their abilities, and to endure discomfort without complaint. The social skills developed during winter months were crucial for community survival. People learned to resolve conflicts quickly and peacefully, since prolonged disputes in confined quarters could threaten everyone's well-being. They learned to share resources fairly and to contribute to group activities even when individual inclination might suggest otherwise. They developed the subtle communication skills needed to maintain privacy and personal space in situations where physical privacy was impossible. That's the side of Viking life we often forget. Not the swords or sails, but the soft scrape of a wooden spoon in a clay pot, the muffled thud of snow falling from a thatched roof, the stillness between stories. These quieter moments reveal the true character of Norse society, the foundation upon which the more dramatic episodes of Viking history were built. The people who would later raid distant coasts and explore unknown oceans first learned patience and endurance in winter longhouses. The skills that made them effective travelers and warriors were developed during months of confined survival, when cooperation and resource management meant the difference between life and death. The soft scrape of wooden spoons in clay pots represented countless meals prepared and shared under difficult circumstances. Each scrape was a small victory against hunger, a moment of nourishment extracted from limited supplies through careful management and culinary skill. The sound spoke to the daily triumph of domestic organization, the unsung heroism of making adequate meals from inadequate ingredients. The muffled thud of snow falling from thatched roofs marked the passage of weather and time, the accumulation and release of winter's burden on human structures. These sounds reminded inhabitants of the ongoing contest between human construction and natural forces, of the constant need to maintain and protect the buildings that made survival possible. Each thud was a reminder of winter's weight and the resilience required to bear it. The stillness between stories was perhaps the most profound aspect of winter life, the quiet moments when narrative ended and reality resumed. In these silences, people contemplated their circumstances, made plans for the future, and found meaning in their immediate experiences. The stillness was not empty, full of possibility, pregnant with the thoughts and dreams that would motivate action when spring finally arrived. So the next time you imagine a Viking, picture not just the helmet and axe, but the man or woman sitting in near darkness, carving a spoon, wondering how much longer the pickled herring will last. This alternative image of Viking life is perhaps more accurate and certainly more universal than the warrior stereotype. The person carving a spoon in the darkness represents the human reality behind the historical legend, the ordinary experience that was the foundation for extraordinary achievements. The act of carving a spoon is both practical and creative, both necessary and expressive, representing the dual nature of survival activities that sustained Norse communities through the hardest months. The concern about food supplies was constant and reasonable, a practical anxiety that shaped daily decisions and long-term planning. The pickled herring, unappetizing as it might be, represented security and survival. Calculating how long supplies would last was a survival skill as important as wielding weapons or navigating by stars. These calculations required both mathematical thinking and psychological resilience, the ability to face potential shortages while maintaining hope and determination. The image of the Viking in darkness, engaged in quiet, productive work while worrying about practical matters, captures the reality of most historical experience. It reminds us that behind every dramatic historical event were months and years of ordinary life, of people managing daily challenges and maintaining the social and economic systems that made civilization possible. The great raids and explorations of the Viking Age were launched by people who had first mastered the unglamorous arts of winter survival. And as the smoke curls toward the beams and the wind whispers outside, let's gently shift our attention to someone who did step out of the longhouse shadows. In the midst of this world of survival and endurance, there emerged individuals whose talents and ambitions transcended the limitations of seasonal survival. While most Norse people focused their creativity on the practical arts of making it through another winter, some channeled their intelligence and artistic ability into forms that would outlast the circumstances of their creation. The transition from survival to achievement, from endurance to excellence, often began in exactly these winter moments. In the stillness between daily tasks, in the quiet hours around the fire, exceptional individuals began to develop the skills and perspectives that would distinguish them from their contemporaries. The same patience that enabled winter survival could be redirected toward mastering complex crafts, memorizing vast amounts of traditional lore, or developing the verbal skills that would make them renowned throughout the Norse world. Among these exceptional individuals, few combined the practical skills of survival with the artistic abilities of genius as completely as the figure we turn to next. He was a man both admired and feared, whose words could be as sharp as his sword, whose reputation for both poetry and violence made him a legend in his own lifetime. His story begins in the same kind of winter longhouse we have been imagining, but his talents and temperament would carry him far beyond the constraints of seasonal survival. This was a man who understood the rhythms of winter endurance, but refused to be limited by them, who took the patience and persistence learned in childhood and applied them to pursuits that would make his name immortal. In examining his life, we see how the foundational experiences of Norse winter survival could be transformed into something approaching greatness, how the ordinary challenges of medieval life could forge extraordinary individuals. Just ahead, we meet Egil Skallagrimsson. Now imagine a very different kind of winter, one not endured quietly, but one simmering with frustration, cold winds, and creative fury. A winter that gives rise not to boredom, but to poetry, harsh, biting, and strange. Picture yourself in a turf-walled hall somewhere in Iceland. The year is 950, and outside the wind howls across volcanic fields covered in snow. Inside, by the guttering flames of a central fire, sits a man with shoulders like a bear and eyes that could freeze mead in the cup. This is the world of Egil Skallagrimsson. Born in Iceland in the early 10th century, Egil was no ordinary Viking. He was both a warrior and a poet, a man who could cleave a skull in the morning and compose a lament by the hearth that evening. His life was steeped in contradiction, admired for his genius, feared for his temper, and remembered as one of the strangest figures in the Icelandic sagas. To understand Egil, you must understand that he existed in a world where words held as much power as weapons, where a well-crafted verse could topple kings, and poorly chosen praise could cost you your head. The Iceland of Egil's youth was a frontier society, barely settled, where the line between civilization and wilderness remained thin as parchment. The island itself seemed to reflect the temperament of its inhabitants, volcanic, unpredictable, prone to sudden eruptions. Geysers shot steam into frozen air, and the aurora borealis painted the winter sky in otherworldly colors. It was a landscape that demanded both toughness and imagination, and Egil possessed both in abundance. From an early age, Egil stood apart. He was large, even as a child, with a brow said to hang low over eyes that never quite softened. The Saga describes him as having thick, coarse hair, a heavy jaw, and hands already scarred from early sword work. According to the Egil Saga, he wrote his first poem at the age of 3. That same year, he also killed another boy over a game. Whether that's true or not, well, Saga writers were known to embellish, but the image it paints is hard to forget. A small boy with big thoughts and a bigger axe. This duality would define Egil throughout his life. While other children played with wooden swords, Egil was already composing verses in the complex skaldic tradition, weaving together metaphors within metaphors in patterns so intricate they resembled verbal lacework. Yet he was equally comfortable with real steel. By the time he reached adolescence, his reputation for both poetry and violence had spread throughout the settlement. His father, Skallagrim, was not exactly warm. He was a strong, stoic settler who had left Norway behind to escape the overreach of King Harald Fairhair. The king's unification of Norway had displaced many proud chieftains who refused to bow to his authority. Rather than submit, Skallagrim had packed his household, his livestock, and his honor aboard a ship and sailed west to the edge of the known world. Iceland, wild and remote, gave him space to rule his land without interference. He ruled it strictly. Skallagrim was a complex figure himself, part farmer, part warrior, part blacksmith. He could forge weapons as easily as he could wield them, and his hands were equally skilled at shaping iron and breaking heads. The farmstead he established was more fortress than home, built to withstand both the elements and human enemies. High earthen walls surrounded buildings constructed with thick timber and turf, designed to keep heat in and danger out. It was here, in this austere environment, that Egil learned the fundamental lessons of his life. That strength must be earned daily. That comfort was temporary. and that words could be weapons if properly forged. Egil's mother, Bera, was quieter, but descended from a line of warriors and skalds poets who used rhythm and metaphor to make sense of the world. She possessed what the Norse called sight, an intuitive understanding of the hidden patterns that governed fate. From her, Egil inherited not just poetic talent, but a kind of supernatural sensitivity to the currents of luck and doom that flowed beneath everyday events. She could read omens in the flight of ravens, interpret dreams, and sense when distant events would soon touch their lives. From both parents, Egil inherited intensity. From Skallagrim came physical strength, tactical cunning, and an absolute refusal to back down from any challenge. From Bera came verbal dexterity, emotional depth, and an almost mystical connection to the power of language. These gifts would serve him well, but they would also make him a dangerous man to cross. Growing up, Egil's life was shaped by exile, resentment, and long dark seasons. The family's circumstances were comfortable by Icelandic standards. They owned good land, cattle, and slaves, but there was always an undercurrent of loss. They were refugees, however prosperous, and the stories told around the hearth were filled with memories of a homeland left behind and enemies who might yet follow them across the sea. The winters were especially formative. Icelandic winters are not merely cold, they are existentially challenging. The sun disappears for months, leaving the world in a twilight that can drive men mad. The wind never stops, and it carries sounds across impossible distances, so that a man lying in his bed might hear his neighbor's cattle lowing from miles away, or catch fragments of conversation from travelers on distant paths. During the colder months, there was little to do but tend livestock, repair equipment, and survive. For most people, winter was a time of endurance. For Egil, it became a time of creation. When not tending to livestock or training with weapons, Egil carved words into memory. He learned the intricate patterns of skaldic verse, full of complex metaphors, called kennings. Sword might be called wound-hoe or battle snake. Blood was wound-dew. The sea became the whale road. These weren't gentle poems, they were tangled, tightly wound puzzles of language, often used to shame rivals or flatter kings. The complexity was intentional. It separated the skilled poet from the mere rhymer, and it allowed dangerous truths to be spoken in ways that gave the speaker plausible deniability. Skaldic poetry was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was a form of cultural currency, a way of preserving history, and occasionally a weapon of war. A skilled skald could immortalize a king's deeds, ensuring his reputation would outlive his bones. Conversely, a satirical verse could destroy a man's honor more effectively than any sword. In a society where reputation was everything, poets wielded genuine power. But Egil's poetry wasn't merely decorative. It was his weapon, as sharp and unpredictable as his sword. He understood instinctively that in a world where most people could not read or write, the person who could craft memorable verses held the keys to immortality. Not just his own immortality, but the immortality of anyone he chose to praise or condemn. His first major test came during his teenage years, when he accompanied his older brother Thorolf on a trading expedition to Norway. The brothers carried goods and silver, but also something more valuable, their reputations as fighting men and poets. Norway in those days was still finding its political balance under King Harald, and the court was always hungry for talented men who might serve as both warriors and entertainers. Egil's arrival at court created immediate complications. He was too young to be taken seriously as a warrior, but too accomplished as a poet to be dismissed. His verses were technically perfect, but they carried an edge of mockery that made listeners uncomfortable. He had not yet learned the delicate art of flattery, and his praise often sounded suspiciously like veiled insults. The situation came to a head during a feast where Egil was invited to compose verses in honor of the king. Instead of the expected flattery, he delivered a poem so ambiguous that it could be read as either praise or subtle mockery. The court fell silent, uncertain how to respond. King Harold himself seemed amused by the young man's audacity, but several of his retainers were less impressed. This episode established a pattern that would follow Egil throughout his life. His talent would open doors, but his personality would often slam them shut again. He was incapable of the kind of diplomatic flexibility that allowed other men to prosper at court. He said what he thought, consequences be damned, and he thought things that were often better left unsaid. The brothers' stay in Norway ended abruptly when a dispute over a woman led to violence. Thorolf killed a man in a duel, and the brothers were forced to flee in the night. Their trading expedition transformed into a desperate escape. They made it back to their ship with royal pursuers close behind, and as they sailed out of the fjord, Egil composed a farewell poem that was equal parts boast and threat. But it was later, during a return trip to Norway years afterward, that Egil's poetry truly saved his life. He had been captured by King Eirik Bloodaxe, with whom he had long-standing enmity, and was meant to be executed at dawn. Eirik was King Harold's son, and he had inherited both his father's throne and his suspicion of independent-minded Icelanders. Egil had made himself particularly obnoxious by killing several of the king's men during various raids and disputes. The night before his execution, sitting in chains in the king's hall, Egil made a desperate gamble. He asked for the chance to compose a praise poem in the king's honor, claiming it would be a shame to die without giving his enemy proper recognition. It was an audacious request from a man facing death, but it appealed to Eirik's vanity and his cultural respect for poetry. That night, in the king's own hall, Egil composed a drapa, a formal poem of praise so intricate and impressive that even Eirik, who hated him, was forced to reconsider. The poem, known as the Head Ransom, consisted of 20 verses, each one more elaborate than the last. Egil compared the king to various mythological heroes, praised his generosity, his wisdom in battle, and his noble lineage. But he did it with such technical virtuosity that the praise transcended mere flattery and became art. Imagine the scene. Egil, dirty and exhausted, his hands bound, reciting 20 verses by heart in the flickering light of the great hall. Each line was a fragile thread between life and death. The fire crackling in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the carved pillars. The court listening in fascination, despite themselves. And the sheer weight of language bending fate itself. The king's retainers sat along the benches, some scowling at this prisoner who dared make demands, others grudgingly impressed by his skill. Queen Gunhild, who had her own reputation as a practitioner of magic, watched from the high seat with calculating eyes. She understood the power of words as well as anyone, and she could sense the dangerous currents flowing beneath Egil's performance. There was a deep cultural reverence for poetry in Norse society, not the soft kind, but the kind that demanded attention and memory. To be a skald was to command history, and Egil knew this. He also knew that his poem had to be perfect, not just good, but technically flawless, emotionally compelling, and memorably phrased. A single weak line, a forced rhyme, or an awkward metaphor could cost him his head. When he finished, the hall fell silent. King Eirik sat motionless on his high seat, considering. The poem had been everything it needed to be. Respectful without being servile, elaborate without being overwrought, memorable without being controversial. More importantly, it demonstrated a level of skill that commanded respect even from enemies. Finally, the king spoke. The poem, he declared, was sufficient ransom for Egil's head. The prisoner would be freed at dawn and given safe passage to his ship. It was a remarkable victory for the power of words over violence, and it cemented Egil's reputation as not just a talented poet, but a man who could literally talk his way out of death. Still, his life was not one of comfort. Egil spent decades abroad fighting, feuding, and occasionally farming. He traveled through England and Norway, aligning himself with kings when convenient, defying them when not. He served as a mercenary for various rulers, fighting in battles from the Scottish Highlands to the English marshlands. His sword was always for hire, but his loyalty was never for sale. During one extended stay in England, Egil married Asgerd, a widow with property and connections. It was a practical match that brought him both wealth and stability, but their relationship was complicated by Egil's restless nature and violent temperament. Asgerd was no shrinking flower herself. She came from a family of strong women, and she could match Egil's stubbornness with her own when necessary. Their household became a gathering place for other Icelandic exiles, traders, and adventurers. Egil's hall was always full of men planning voyages, settling disputes, or simply sharing news from home. Despite his reputation for being difficult, people sought out his company. He was a man who made things happen, and in the uncertain world of the early medieval period, such men were valuable allies. But Egil was stubborn and difficult, and didn't pretend otherwise. He had opinions about everything and the confidence to express them, regardless of whether anyone had asked. He quarreled with neighbors over boundary stones, with merchants over prices, with priests over theology, and with kings over policy. His life was a series of disputes, punctuated by brief periods of uneasy peace. Some of these quarrels were trivial, the kind of personality conflicts that arise when strong-willed people live in close proximity. Others were more serious. Egil once became involved in a complex legal dispute over an inheritance that lasted for years and required the intervention of multiple courts. He pursued the matter with characteristic determination, treating it less as a business matter than as a test of his honor. These legal battles revealed another side of Egil's character, his deep respect for law and procedure. Despite his violent reputation, he was a careful student of legal codes and precedents. He understood that in a society without strong central authority, law was the only alternative to endless bloodshed. When he fought in court, he fought as hard as he did on the battlefield, but he fought with words and witnesses rather than swords and shields. Tragedy followed him too. Egil lost two of his sons, one to drowning, one to illness. The drowning occurred during a summer fishing expedition, when the boy, barely grown to manhood, fell from a boat during a sudden storm. Despite desperate search efforts, his body was never recovered. The second son died during a winter plague that swept through their settlement, taking the young and old while sparing those in their prime. The grief he expressed in verse was profound, even for modern ears. In his poem Sanatoric, The Loss of Sons, he poured out sorrow with a precision that stings even across centuries. The poem is remarkable, not just for its emotional intensity, but for its unflinching examination of a father's grief. Egil did not simply mourn. He analyzed his mourning, questioned it, and ultimately transcended it through the act of poetic creation. The verses describe a heart dragged down by grief and a world made meaningless by absence. He wrote of how the sea had become his enemy, stealing his son and refusing to give up the body for proper burial. He described the emptiness of his hall, where his son's voice would never again be heard. But he also wrote of the strange comfort found in the act of composition itself, how shaping grief into words somehow made it bearable. One of the most powerful passages describes his relationship with Odin, the god of poetry and war. Egil acknowledged that Odin had given him the gift of verse, but he also blamed the god for taking away what he loved most. It was a complex theological position, recognizing divine power while refusing to submit to it completely. Even in his deepest grief, Egil maintained his fundamental independence. Yet even here, Egil maintained restraint. He acknowledged the pain, but never pleaded. His verses are like his life, rough-edged, stoic, unflinching. They offer no false comfort, only the stark truth of loss. There are no promises of reunion in an afterlife, no attempts to find meaning in senseless tragedy. There is only the fact of loss and the human capacity to endure it. The poem also reveals Egil's complicated relationship with his own reputation. He had spent his life building a name for himself through acts of violence and verbal virtuosity, but the deaths of his sons forced him to confront the ultimate futility of earthly achievement. What good was fame when those you loved most were beyond its reach? What value did poetry have when it could not bring back the dead? These questions gave the poem its emotional weight. Egil was not simply mourning his sons. He was mourning the collapse of his entire worldview. The values that had guided his life's strength, courage, artistic skill, reputation suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of ultimate loss. Yet rather than abandoning these values, he chose to examine them more deeply, to understand their limitations while still affirming their importance. And throughout it all, through raids, duels, shipwrecks, and legal disputes, Egil kept writing. His output was prodigious, encompassing everything from brief occasional verses to elaborate formal compositions. He wrote praise poems for kings, satirical verses about enemies, love poems for his wife, and elegies for fallen friends. His work provides a remarkable window into the emotional and intellectual life of a medieval warrior. Many of these poems have been lost, surviving only in fragments or in the memories of later storytellers. But what remains is impressive, both for its technical skill and its emotional range. Egil could be tender or vicious, philosophical or practical, depending on what the moment required. His voice was unmistakably his own, but it was also flexible enough to encompass the full spectrum of human experience. His saga is among the longest and richest of the Icelandic sagas, detailing his life from childhood to old age. The saga itself is a kind of extended poem, weaving together history, mythology, and psychology in ways that still seem remarkably modern. Whether Egil actually lived exactly as the saga describes is less important than the fact that someone thought this was a life worth preserving in such detail. The saga presents a complete human being, contradictions and all, rather than a simple hero or villain. In his final years, Egil reportedly grew blind. This was perhaps the cruelest blow fate could have dealt to a man who had always prided himself on his physical prowess. Unable to fight or travel, he was forced to depend on others for basic needs. But even in blindness, he remained formidable. He would sit by the hearth, reciting verses from memory, still demanding, still proud. His blindness may have been physical, but his inner vision remained sharp. The poems from this period show no decline in skill or passion. If anything, they demonstrate a new kind of intensity, the focused energy of a man who knows his time is limited and is determined to make every word count. You can almost hear him old, growling, dictating one last stanza to a scribe or family member, the wind outside rattling the turf roof, the embers casting long shadows on his gnarled hands. His voice would have been rough from years of shouting orders and reciting verses, but it would still carry the authority of a man who had never learned to doubt himself. The image is both pathetic and magnificent, a once mighty warrior reduced to sitting by the fire, but still capable of creating beauty from the raw materials of language and memory. In some ways, it represents the triumph of art over circumstance, the victory of human creativity over the limitations imposed by age and infirmity. Family members and visitors would gather to hear the old man recite, partly out of respect, partly out of genuine fascination. Even those who had found him difficult in his prime had to acknowledge his extraordinary gifts. He was a living repository of history, a man who had witnessed the transformation of the Norse world from tribal society to something approaching modern statehood. But Egil was never content to be merely a keeper of old stories. Even in his final years, he continued to compose new material, responding to current events with the same sharp eye and sharper tongue that had made him famous. He remained intellectually engaged with the world around him, offering commentary on political developments, social changes, and the eternal human dramas that played out in his community. In a way, Egil is a mirror of the Viking world itself. Harsh, cold, and unpredictable, but threaded with unexpected depth. He embodied both the violence and the artistry of his culture, the restless energy that drove men to sail beyond the horizon and sophisticated artistic traditions that made sense of what they found there. The Viking world was never as simple as popular imagination suggests. These were not mere raiders and pillagers, but members of a complex society with rich oral traditions, sophisticated legal systems, and deep spiritual beliefs. They were farmers and merchants, as well as warriors, poets and philosophers, as well as fighters. Egil represents this complexity in concentrated form. To truly understand Egil's world, we must consider the broader context of Norse society in the 10th century. This was a period of tremendous upheaval and transformation. The old tribal structures were giving way to centralized kingdoms. Traditional gods were being challenged by the arrival of Christianity, and the familiar rhythms of seasonal raiding were evolving into more sophisticated forms of international trade and diplomacy. Iceland itself stood at the center of these changes. The island had been settled primarily by Norwegian refugees fleeing King Harald's consolidation of power, but it quickly developed its own unique character. Unlike the kingdoms of mainland Scandinavia, Iceland had no king. Instead, it was governed by a complex system of local chieftains and legal assemblies that met annually at the Althing, a remarkable early experiment in democratic governance. This political arrangement suited men like Egil perfectly. He was too independent to serve as anyone's retainer, too proud to bow to royal authority, but clever enough to thrive in a system based on personal reputation and legal maneuvering. The Icelandic Commonwealth rewarded exactly the qualities he possessed in abundance: verbal skill, physical courage, and an unwillingness to back down from any challenge. The economic foundation of this society was equally complex. While raiding and warfare captured the imagination of saga writers, the daily reality involved extensive networks of trade, agriculture, and craft production. Icelandic merchants traveled as far as Constantinople and Greenland, carrying everything from walrus ivory to silver coins. The island's strategic location made it a natural stopping point for ships traveling between Europe and the newly discovered lands in the west. Egil participated fully in this commercial world. His raids were often as much about trade as conquest, and he understood the economic value of the relationships he built through both violence and poetry. A well-timed verse could open trading opportunities, while a successful raid could provide the capital needed for larger commercial ventures. The line between warrior and merchant was often blurred, and successful men like Egil needed to be both. The religious landscape of Egil's world was equally complex. While Christianity was making inroads throughout Scandinavia, the old gods retained their hold on popular imagination. Egil himself seems to have maintained a flexible approach to religion, invoking Thor when he needed strength in battle, calling on Odin when he composed poetry, and showing respectful interest in Christian teachings when circumstances required it. This religious pragmatism was typical of his era. The Norse pantheon had always been characterized by complexity and contradiction, with gods who were neither entirely good nor evil, but rather embodiments of natural forces that could be helpful or destructive depending on circumstances. Egil's own contradictory nature fitted perfectly into this theological framework. His relationship with Odin was particularly complex. As the god of both war and poetry, Odin represented the two sides of Egil's character. But Odin was also known as a breaker of oaths, a stirrer of trouble, a god who gave gifts only to take them away again. Egil's poetry often reflects this ambivalent relationship, praising the god while simultaneously questioning his motives and methods. The technical aspects of Egil's poetry deserve closer examination, as they reveal the sophisticated intellectual culture that flourished in medieval Iceland. Skaldic verse was among the most complex poetic forms ever developed, requiring mastery of intricate rules governing meter, alliteration, and metaphor. A single stanza might contain multiple interwoven sentences, each following different grammatical patterns, all while maintaining perfect rhythmic structure. The metaphorical language, or kennings, added another layer of complexity. These weren't simple comparisons, but elaborate conceptual puzzles that required extensive cultural knowledge to decode. A kenning for gold might reference the myth of Sigurd and the dragon, requiring listeners to understand not just the story, but its various symbolic meanings. Poetry became a form of cultural encryption, accessible only to those with sufficient education and memory. This complexity served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the poet's skill and learning. It created memorable patterns that aided in oral transmission, and it allowed dangerous or controversial ideas to be expressed in ways that provided plausible deniability. A skilled poet could insult a king while appearing to praise him, or reveal military intelligence while seeming to compose innocent entertainment. Egil's mastery of these techniques was legendary even among his contemporaries. His verses were quoted and analyzed throughout the Norse world, and later scholars would study them for centuries as examples of the form at its most sophisticated. But what set him apart was not just technical skill, but his ability to use complex forms to express genuine emotion and insight. Consider his famous head ransom poem more closely. While the surface meaning praised King Eirik, the deeper structure revealed layers of irony and subtle threat. Egil managed to save his life while simultaneously demonstrating his intellectual superiority over his captor. The king might hold physical power, but Egil possessed something rarer and more durable: the ability to shape how events would be remembered. This incident also illustrates the practical power of reputation in medieval society. Egil's previous works had established him as a poet of extraordinary skill, and this reputation literally saved his life. King Eirik could afford to execute an ordinary prisoner, but killing a renowned skald would have damaged his own standing in the cultural community. Poets were too valuable and too dangerous to be casually destroyed. The preservation and transmission of Egil's work reveals another fascinating aspect of medieval culture. In a largely illiterate society, poetry served as both entertainment and historical record. Professional reciters memorized thousands of lines of verse and traveled from hall to hall, sharing news, preserving genealogies, and maintaining cultural continuity across vast distances. These reciters were not passive transmitters of information. They adapted their material to suit different audiences, emphasized different aspects of familiar stories, and gradually shaped the tradition through countless small modifications. Egil's saga as we know it today represents the end product of centuries of this process, a collaborative work created by dozens of unknown storytellers working across multiple generations. The saga itself reveals the values and concerns of its various creators. Early versions probably focused more heavily on Egil's exploits as a warrior and raider, while later Christian copyists may have emphasized his poetic achievements and complex psychology. The version that survives today attempts to balance these different perspectives, presenting Egil as neither simple hero nor villain, but as a complete human being whose life reflected the contradictions of his age. But even the written saga represents only a fraction of what was once a much larger body of material. References in other sources suggest that dozens of poems attributed to Egil have been lost, along with countless anecdotes and episodes that once formed part of his legend. What survives is impressive enough, but it's merely the tip of an enormous iceberg of cultural memory. The influence of Egil's work extended far beyond the boundaries of Iceland or the medieval period. When the Icelandic sagas were rediscovered by European scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries, they helped reshape modern understanding of medieval literature and culture. Writers like William Morris and W.H. Auden found inspiration in the stark beauty of Icelandic verse, while scholars recognized in the sagas some of the earliest examples of realistic psychological fiction. Modern Icelandic culture still celebrates Egil as a national hero, but he's a complicated kind of hero, one whose virtues are inseparably linked to serious character flaws. He represents the Icelandic ideal of independence carried to extremes, the refusal to compromise, taken to self-destructive lengths. In a sense, he embodies both the strengths and weaknesses of his culture. Contemporary readers approaching Egil's story often struggle with its moral ambiguity. We expect our heroes to be heroic and our villains to be villainous, but Egil defies such simple categorization. He was capable of great beauty and terrible cruelty, sometimes within the same day. His loyalty to friends was absolute, but his treatment of enemies was merciless. He created immortal art while living a life marked by frequent violence. This complexity makes him more interesting than conventional heroes, but also more challenging. We cannot simply admire him or condemn him. We must grapple with the contradictions that made him human. In this respect, Egil serves as a mirror not just for his own age, but for ours. We too live in a world where good and evil are often intermingled, where our greatest strengths can become our worst weaknesses, where the line between creation and destruction is often disturbingly thin. The question of what made Egil who he was continues to fascinate scholars and general readers alike. Was he shaped primarily by his harsh environment, his difficult family relationships, or some innate aspect of his personality? The saga offers evidence for all these interpretations, but refuses to provide definitive answers. Like real life, it presents us with a complex web of causation that resists simple explanation. Perhaps this is the most valuable lesson Egil's story offers: that human beings are irreducibly complex, that our greatest achievements often emerge from our deepest struggles, and that the attempt to understand ourselves and others requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to accept contradiction. In a world that often demands simple answers to complex questions, Egil reminds us that the most important truths are usually complicated. A man shaped by endless winters, who chose to fight them not just with weapons, but with words. Words that still reach us now, over 1,000 years later. His poetry survives in manuscripts, copied and recopied by generations of scribes, who recognized its value, even when they might not have understood its original context. Modern readers approaching Egil's work are often surprised by its sophistication. The image of Vikings as crude barbarians dissolves when confronted with verse of such technical complexity and emotional nuance. These were people with inner lives as rich and conflicted as our own, struggling with the same fundamental questions that occupy us today. How do we find meaning in a seemingly meaningless universe? How do we maintain dignity in the face of inevitable loss? How do we balance our obligations to others with our need for personal fulfillment? Egil's answers to these questions were distinctly his own, shaped by his particular temperament and historical circumstances. The questions themselves are universal, and his responses retain their power to move and instruct us. He refused easy consolation, rejected simple answers, and insisted on confronting reality in all its complexity. So the next time you think of Viking poetry, imagine Egil not with a lyre, but with a scowl. Not serenading a maiden, but storming a king's hall with metaphors honed like blades. Picture him in that smoky hall, the fire throwing weird shadows on the walls, his voice rising and falling in the ancient rhythms that carried his words across centuries. He is simultaneously the most and least typical Viking imaginable. A warrior who fought with words, a poet who killed with swords, a man who found beauty in the heart of darkness, and darkness in the heart of beauty. His legacy extends far beyond the borders of Iceland or the boundaries of the medieval period. Every writer who has ever used language as a weapon, every artist who has refused to compromise their vision for the sake of popularity, every person who has insisted on speaking truth regardless of consequences can trace their lineage back to figures like Egil. He reminds us that art and life are not separate spheres, but different aspects of the same fundamental human drive to impose meaning on chaos. And now, from the stormy sagas of one unforgettable man, we turn to something buried beneath the soil, a mystery wrapped in wood and iron, sealed beneath the earth for over 1,000 years. While Egil's story echoes through literature and legend, our next tale emerges from the silent testimony of archaeology, from objects that have waited patiently in darkness for their moment to speak. The transition from the verbal artistry of the skalds to the material artistry of ancient craftsmen is not as jarring as it might seem, for both represent attempts to transcend the limitations of mortality, to create something that will outlast its maker. Let's drift gently toward the Oseberg ship and the secrets it still holds. The silence of the Norwegian countryside in 1904 was broken by the methodical scraping of shovels against earth. Gabriel Gustafsson, an archaeologist from the University of Oslo, had been called to investigate what local farmers initially dismissed as just another burial mound. Such things dotted the landscape of Vestfold County like ancient punctuation marks, remnants of a time when the dead were honored with earth and stone. But as Gustafsson's team began their careful excavation near the Oseberg farm, they quickly realized this was something far more extraordinary than a simple grave. Imagine the soft creak of timber shifting under centuries of earth, the scent of wet clay and old iron, the muffled scrape of archaeologists brushing away time, layer by patient layer. And beneath it all, the silent hull of a ship that once sailed not across oceans, but into the unknown. The first glimpse of carved wood emerging from the blue-gray clay must have been breathtaking. Here, preserved in the anaerobic environment of the burial mound, was timber that had been worked by Viking hands over 1,000 years earlier. Each stroke of the chisel, each careful curve of the dragon's head, had been frozen in time by the peculiar chemistry of the soil. The clay had acted like a medieval time capsule, sealing away not just wood and metal, but the very essence of a culture that had vanished into legend. This is the Oseberg ship burial, and it is one of the most curious and beautiful puzzles of the Viking world. The excavation took months. Every artifact had to be carefully documented, photographed, and preserved before the Norwegian air could begin its work of decay. The ship itself was enormous by the standards of the time. 70 feet of graceful curves and intricate carvings, its prow rising like a question mark against the sky. But it was not the size that made it remarkable. It was the artistry. Every available surface had been decorated with sinuous dragons, their bodies intertwining in patterns that seemed to flow like water. The craftsmanship was so fine that modern woodworkers still marvel at the precision of the joints, the smoothness of the planks, the way the entire vessel seemed to have been carved from a single living piece of wood. Discovered in 1904 on a farm near Tønsberg, Norway, the Oseberg burial was unlike anything excavators had seen before. Beneath a low grassy mound, wrapped in turf and earth, lay a nearly intact Viking ship, its wooden carvings swirling with dragons and curling tendrils. It had not been buried in haste. It was arranged with intention, with reverence, with mystery. The ship's construction told a story of priorities that challenged everything scholars thought they knew about Viking society. This was not a warship. The hull was too shallow for ocean voyages, too delicate for the brutal work of raiding. Instead, it seemed designed for ceremony, for procession, for the kind of stately travel that spoke of power rather than violence. The keel curved upward at both ends, giving the vessel an almost serpentine grace. The steering oar was carved with intricate knotwork. Even the iron nails that held the planks together were arranged in patterns, as though the builders could not resist turning even the most mundane elements into art. But if the ship was magnificent, its contents were even more intriguing. Inside the burial chamber, archaeologists discovered a world in miniature, a carefully curated collection of objects that seemed to represent every aspect of Viking life. There were practical items, wooden buckets still bearing the marks of their maker's tools, iron knives worn smooth by use, cooking pots blackened by countless fires. There were luxury goods, silk ribbons that had traveled thousands of miles along ancient trade routes, intricate jewelry wrought from silver and gold, carved combs so fine they seemed meant for ceremony rather than daily grooming. Inside the ship were the remains of two women, one elderly, one younger, both laid on a raised platform, surrounded by objects, some mundane, others extraordinary. There were buckets, textiles, wooden carts, a bed, and animal bones, carved sledges, a richly ornamented wagon, painted red and gold, and intricate tools of daily life, preserved by the blue-gray clay that had sealed the chamber. No weapons, no shields, no helmets. This was no warrior's grave. The arrangement of the burial chamber spoke of careful planning. The two women had been placed on a wooden platform in the ship's stern, their bodies oriented toward the bow as though they were passengers on a final voyage. Around them, the grave goods were arranged with the precision of a ritual. Textiles were folded and stacked. Tools were grouped by function. Even the animal bones, remnants of the funeral feast, were placed with deliberate care. The textiles alone represented a treasure trove of information about Viking culture. Preserved by the same clay that had protected the ship, these fabrics revealed a world of color and pattern that shattered the popular image of Vikings as rough, uncivilized raiders. There were woolen cloaks dyed in brilliant reds and blues, their colors achieved through complex processes involving exotic materials imported from distant lands. Silk ribbons, their origins traceable to the workshops of Constantinople or even further east, were woven into decorative patterns that spoke of wealth and sophisticated trade networks. The most remarkable textile discovery was a tapestry, its surface covered with intricate figures that seemed to tell a story. Scholars have debated its meaning for over a century. Some see religious symbolism, perhaps a representation of the Viking cosmos with its 9 worlds and world tree. Others interpret it as a historical narrative, possibly depicting the lives of the buried women themselves. The figures march across the fabric in procession, their faces solemn, their poses formal. They carry objects that might be ritual implements or symbols of authority. The overall effect is both beautiful and mysterious, a visual poem whose meaning remains tantalizingly out of reach. The wooden artifacts were equally impressive. A ornate cart, its wheels carved with spiraling patterns, had been dismantled and carefully arranged in the burial chamber. Sledges, their runners worn smooth by use, bore decorative carvings that transformed utilitarian objects into works of art. There was even a bucket with metal fittings, so fine they seemed better suited to a palace than a farmyard. Each piece spoke of a culture that saw beauty and meaning in the objects of daily life. They'd refused to separate the practical from the sacred. Perhaps most intriguing were the animal bones scattered throughout the burial. These were not random remains, but carefully selected bones from specific animals, each chosen for its symbolic significance. There were bones from horses, animals sacred to the god Odin and essential to the Viking way of life. Cattle bones spoke of wealth and prosperity, as these animals represented the foundation of agricultural society. Even the bones of smaller animals, dogs and cats, had been included, perhaps companions meant to serve their mistresses in the afterlife. The ship itself was beautiful, not designed for raiding or war, but for ceremony. It had been built for style, not speed. The prow rose like a spiraled tongue, its keel curling into the air as though tasting the wind. Every surface was carved, every joint polished. It spoke of power, yes, but also of artistry, of devotion to craft, of a culture that honored beauty even in death. The construction techniques used in the ship's creation revealed a level of sophistication that challenged many assumptions about Viking technology. The planks were not simply nailed together, but were carefully shaped to create a smooth, seamless hull. The joints were so precise that they required no caulking, the wood itself forming a watertight seal. The dragon heads that adorned the prow were not mere decoration but functional elements, their curves designed to deflect spray and improve the ship's handling in rough water. The wood itself told a story of careful selection and preparation. The oak used for the hull had been chosen for its strength and durability, while the decorative elements were carved from different woods, selected for their working properties. Pine was used for areas requiring flexibility, ash for elements that needed to bear stress. The timber had been seasoned, carefully dried, and prepared over months or even years before construction began. This was not the work of simple craftsmen, but of master shipwrights who understood their materials with an intimacy born of generations of experience. The carvings that covered every surface of the ship were masterpieces of medieval art. The dragon heads were not simply decorative, but were imbued with meaning that would have been immediately recognizable to a Viking audience. The serpentine bodies twisted and coiled in patterns that echoed the great world serpent of Norse mythology, the monster that encircled the earth and would one day devour it. The intertwining forms created a visual rhythm that seemed to move even when the ship was still, as though the dragons were alive and swimming through the wood itself. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the ship's decoration was its subtlety. Unlike the bold, aggressive imagery often associated with Viking art, the Oseberg carvings were elegant, almost delicate. The dragon's expressions were not fierce, but contemplative, their eyes seeming to gaze into some distant realm. The overall effect was one of quiet power, of authority that did not need to shout to be heard. And yet, we don't know who they were. The two women were laid with care, their bones fragile, their identities long since erased by time. One was in her 80s, the other in her 50s. No written names, no clear titles, just their presence, commanding, deliberate, solemn. Archaeologists found no inscriptions to identify them, no artifacts that directly stated their roles. But the richness of the burial suggests someone important. Perhaps a queen, perhaps a priestess, perhaps both. The absence of clear identification has made the Oseberg women one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. In an age when power was often displayed through obvious symbols, sword and shield, crown and scepter, these women chose to take their secrets with them into the grave. A few clues we have are tantalizing but ambiguous. The older woman showed signs of advanced arthritis, her bones telling a story of a long life lived in comfort, but not without pain. The younger woman had died violently, her skull bearing the marks of what forensic experts believe was a fatal blow. Was she a sacrifice meant to accompany her mistress into the afterlife? Or was she herself a person of importance? Her death part of some larger tragedy that claimed them both? The lack of weapons in the burial is particularly significant. In a culture where martial prowess was highly valued, the absence of swords, spears, or armor suggests that these women's power came from other sources. Perhaps they were priestesses, wielding influence through their connection to the divine rather than through force of arms. Perhaps they were political leaders, using diplomacy and alliance building to maintain their authority. Or perhaps they represented a different kind of power altogether, one that has been lost to history, along with so much else about Viking society. There are theories, of course. Some believe the older woman was Sa, the grandmother of King Harald Farer, the first king to unify Norway. If true, the Oseberg burial is not just a grave, but a monument to a dynasty. The historical Sais is mentioned in the sagas as a powerful figure in her own right, a woman who wielded influence through her connections to multiple royal houses. She was said to be beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless when crossed. The sagas tell of her involvement in political machinations that shaped the course of Norwegian history, her marriage alliances and strategic divorces creating and breaking kingdoms. If the older woman in the Oseberg burial was indeed Sa, then the ship becomes something more than a grave. It becomes a statement, a declaration of power that transcends death itself. The wealth displayed in the burial, the artistry of the ship, the careful arrangement of the grave goods, all would have been meant to send a message to the living. Here lies a woman who shaped the destiny of nations, who was honored not just in life but in death, whose memory was worth preserving in the most magnificent way possible. The timing of the burial supports this theory. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Oseberg ship was interred in the mid-9th century, precisely the period when the historical Saga would have died. The location, too, is significant. Vestfold County was the heart of the kingdom that would eventually become Norway, the region where Harald Fairhair consolidated his power. For his grandmother to be buried here, in the very landscape she had helped shape, would have been a fitting tribute to her influence. But the Saga theory, compelling as it is, remains unproven. The sagas that mention her were written centuries after her death, and their historical accuracy is questionable. Medieval chroniclers were not above embellishing their stories, adding dramatic details that made for better narrative but questionable history. The identification of the older woman as Saga is based on circumstantial evidence, suggestive but not conclusive. Others suggest a spiritual role, that these women were seeresses, Vavlur, women who practiced a kind of ritual magic known as seer. The presence of a staff, thought by some to be a magical tool, adds weight to this idea. The staff, an ornate wooden rod topped with metal fittings, is one of the most enigmatic objects in the burial. Its purpose is unclear, but its presence suggests ritual significance. In Norse mythology, similar staffs were associated with the practice of seer, a form of magic that involved prophecy, healing, and communication with the spirit world. The Vavlur were among the most respected and feared figures in Viking society. They were said to possess the ability to see into the future, to communicate with the dead, to influence fate itself through their rituals. Unlike the warriors who gained fame through battle, the Vavlur wielded power through knowledge, through their understanding of the hidden forces that shaped the world. They were consulted by kings and commoners alike, their prophecies shaping political decisions and personal choices. The evidence for the Oseberg women as Vavlur is intriguing but not definitive. The staff could have been a symbol of secular authority rather than magical power. The absence of other clearly ritual objects in the burial is also puzzling. If these women were indeed practitioners of seer, one might expect to find more evidence of their craft. Runes, amulets, bones used for divination. Instead, the burial seems to emphasize luxury and craftsmanship rather than spiritual practice. Yet the very absence of conventional religious symbols might itself be significant. The practice of seer was associated with the goddess Freya, whose worship was often conducted in private, away from the public ceremonies dedicated to Odin and Thor. The Oseberg women might have been practitioners of this more secretive form of spirituality, their true beliefs hidden beneath a veneer of conventional burial practices. Still others argue for a ceremonial function, that the Oseberg women were symbols of power, entombed not because of who they were, but because of what they represented: land, lineage, the sacred balance between life and death. This theory suggests that the burial was not about honoring specific individuals, but about reinforcing broader concepts of authority and continuity. The ship becomes a symbol of the journey from life to death, the women representatives of the fertility and prosperity that made civilization possible. This interpretation is supported by the agricultural symbolism present throughout the burial. The cart and sledges suggest travel across land rather than sea, the movement of goods and people that sustained Viking society. The animal bones represent the livestock that formed the foundation of wealth. Even the textiles, with their patterns of intertwining vines and flowering plants, speak of growth and abundance. The overall effect is of a burial that celebrates not just the dead, but the living world they left behind. The ceremonial theory also explains some of the burial's puzzling aspects. The hastily constructed mound, the poor preservation of some artifacts, the evidence of later looting, all suggest that the burial was as much about the act of burial as about the objects buried. The ceremony itself, a gathering of the community to honor the dead, might have been more important than the physical remains left behind. We may never know for sure. And perhaps that is the point. The mystery of the Oseberg women has endured for over a century, precisely because it resists easy answers. Unlike the clear-cut narratives of sagas and chronicles, the burial speaks in symbols and suggestions, in the language of objects rather than words. It invites interpretation while frustrating certainty, offering glimpses of a world that remains tantalizingly out of reach. This ambiguity is not a failure of archaeology, but one of its greatest strengths. The Oseberg burial forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge, to acknowledge that the past is not a simple story, but a complex web of possibilities. It challenges us to think beyond the stereotypes and assumptions that often cloud our understanding of history, to consider the full humanity of people who lived and died 1,000 years ago. Because the Oseberg ship tells us as much through absence as it does through presence. The missing swords, the missing runes, the silence of the grave. It all leaves space for reflection, for wondering, for imagining the lives these women led and the winter of their passing. The absence of weapons in the burial is particularly telling. In a culture where martial prowess was highly valued, where swords were passed down through generations as family heirlooms, the decision to bury these women without arms speaks to a different kind of power. Perhaps they wielded influence through wealth rather than warfare, through diplomacy rather than violence. Perhaps they were leaders in a time when leadership meant something different than it would in later ages. The missing runes are equally significant. The Vikings were not illiterate barbarians, but possessed a sophisticated writing system that they used for everything from grave markers to love letters. The absence of runic inscriptions in the Oseberg burial suggests either that the women's identities were so well known that they needed no introduction, or that secrecy was more important than commemoration. Either possibility opens up intriguing questions about the nature of power and memory in Viking society. The silence of the grave itself is perhaps the most profound absence of all. Unlike the dramatic narratives of the sagas, with their tales of heroic deeds and violent deaths, the Oseberg burial offers only quiet mystery. The women lie in their ship as though sleeping, their faces turned toward some distant shore. They carry no messages for the living, offer no final words of wisdom or warning. They have become part of the landscape, their bones returning to the earth that once concealed their ship. Even the burial itself holds contradictions. The ship had been looted long ago, probably in the Viking Age itself. Some precious items were taken, but much was left behind. Why? Perhaps out of fear, perhaps reverence. Or maybe the real treasure wasn't gold, but the ship itself, a vessel to carry souls across the veil. The evidence of ancient looting adds another layer to the mystery. The robbers had clearly been selective, taking some items while leaving others that seem equally valuable. This suggests they were not simple thieves, but people with specific knowledge about the burial, perhaps even members of the community that had originally interred the women. The looting might have been part of a larger ritual, a way of connecting with the dead by taking something from their grave. The timing of the looting is also significant. It appears to have occurred within decades of the original burial, suggesting that the ship's location was never truly secret. This challenges the idea that the burial was meant to be a permanent memorial, instead suggesting that it was part of an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The ship was not just a grave, but a shrine, a place where the community could come to honor their ancestors and perhaps seek their guidance. The selectivity of the looters also raises questions about the nature of value in Viking society. Some objects that seem precious to modern eyes were left behind, while others that appear mundane were taken. This suggests that the Vikings had different priorities than we might expect, that they valued some things for reasons that are no longer clear to us. The real treasure might not have been gold or silver, something more intangible. Memory, connection, the link between past and present. The way the burial was constructed also suggests urgency. The grave mound was made quickly and poorly sealed. Moisture crept in. Decay set upon the wood. Was the burial rushed? Or was the craftsmanship of the ship meant to compensate for the haste? Historians are unsure. The physical evidence of the burial suggests a tension between haste and ceremony. The ship itself was prepared with extraordinary care, its decorations polished to perfection, its grave goods arranged with ritual precision. Yet the mound that covered it was crude by comparison, its construction hasty and its sealing inadequate. This contradiction suggests that the burial was conducted under pressure, perhaps in response to some crisis that demanded immediate action. The poor construction of the mound had consequences that the builders might not have anticipated. Water seeped in through the inadequate sealing, creating the anaerobic conditions that preserved the ship, but also causing damage to many of the organic materials. Some textiles rotted away completely, their presence known only through the metal fittings that once adorned them. Wooden objects warped and cracked as moisture levels fluctuated. The preservation of the ship was almost accidental, a fortunate side effect of poor construction rather than deliberate planning. The urgency of the burial might have been related to the political situation of the time. The 9th century was a period of intense conflict in Norway, as competing kingdoms struggled for dominance. The death of a powerful leader might have created a power vacuum that demanded immediate action. The burial of the Oseberg women might have been as much about securing political stability as about honoring the dead. Alternatively, the haste might have been driven by practical considerations. The ship burial was an enormous undertaking, requiring the coordination of hundreds of people and vast resources. The longer the process took, the greater the risk of interference from enemies or the decay of perishable grave goods. The builders might have chosen speed over perfection, accepting the risk of poor preservation in order to complete the burial while conditions were favorable. And then there are the textiles, some of the best preserved Viking fabrics ever found. Woven with patterns, dyed in rich colors, stitched with care. They offer a rare glimpse into Viking art beyond swords and shields. These were people who saw beauty in daily things, who brought color into the darkest season, who prepared for death not with dread, but with ceremony. The textile discoveries from Oseberg revolutionized our understanding of Viking material culture. Before these finds, most of what we knew about Viking clothing came from later sources or from archaeological evidence that had been too degraded to provide detailed information. The Oseberg textiles revealed a world of sophisticated craftsmanship and artistic achievement that challenged every stereotype about Viking society. The techniques used to create these fabrics were remarkably advanced. The weavers had access to a wide range of materials, from local wool and linen to imported silk and precious metals. They used complex weaving patterns that required considerable skill and experience to execute. The dyes they employed came from sources both local and exotic: madder root for red, woad for blue, saffron for yellow. Some colors required multiple stages of processing, each step carefully timed to achieve the desired result. The patterns themselves were works of art. Geometric designs alternated with representational images, creating textiles that were both beautiful and meaningful. Some patterns appear to have had specific symbolic significance, perhaps representing gods, heroes, or important events. Others were purely decorative, designed to display the weaver's skill and the owner's wealth. The overall effect was of textiles that were not just functional, but were statements of identity and status. The preservation of these fabrics was remarkable. The combination of the burial environment and the presence of metal objects created conditions that prevented decay while maintaining the integrity of the fibers. Modern analysis has revealed details about the construction of the textiles that would have been impossible to determine from the graded examples. We can see the individual threads, the knots where broken fibers were repaired, the variations in tension that reveal the personality of the weaver. The social implications of these textile discoveries are profound. The skill required to create such fabrics suggests the existence of specialized craftspeople, probably women, who devoted their lives to mastering these techniques. The wealth required to obtain the materials suggests extensive trade networks and accumulated resources. The time required to complete such projects suggests societies stable enough to support long-term artistic endeavors. The textiles also reveal something about the values of Viking society. In a culture often portrayed as obsessed with warfare and conquest, the Oseberg fabrics show a deep appreciation for beauty, craftsmanship, and artistic achievement. These were not utilitarian objects, but luxury goods, created for display and ceremony. They suggest a society that valued artistic expression as much as military prowess, that saw beauty as worthy of investment and preservation. The range of textile techniques represented in the burial is also impressive. There were examples of tablet weaving, a complex technique that produced decorative bands and straps. There were embroidered fabrics, their surfaces covered with intricate needlework that transformed simple cloth into works of art. There were even examples of what appears to be tapestry weaving, a technique that allows for the creation of complex pictorial designs. The international character of some of the textiles is also noteworthy. Silk ribbons clearly imported from distant lands were incorporated into the burial, suggesting trade relationships that extended far beyond Scandinavia. These exotic materials were not simply collected, but were integrated into local artistic traditions, creating hybrid works that reflected both foreign influences and indigenous values. Today, the Oseberg ship sits in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, a hushed hall of dark wood and dim light. Visitors walk slowly. They whisper. There's a kind of reverence that takes over. Not fear, not awe exactly, but a quiet respect. As though the ship still carries something with it. Not ghosts, not curses. Just memory. A weight of time that lingers in the grain of the timber. The museum itself has become part of the Oseberg story. Built specifically to house the ship and its artifacts, the building was designed to evoke the atmosphere of the burial chamber. The lighting is deliberately subdued, creating an environment that encourages contemplation rather than casual observation. The display cases are arranged to guide visitors through the burial in a specific sequence, recreating the experience of the original excavation. The ship itself dominates the space, its hull rising from the museum floor like a beached whale. The wood has been treated with preservatives, its surface sealed against further decay, but it still bears the marks of its long burial. The grain is visible in the artificial light, each growth ring a record of seasons that passed 1,000 years ago. The carvings remain sharp, their details as crisp as the day they were completed. The artifacts surrounding the ship tell their own stories. The cartwheels, their spokes still bearing the marks of the craftsman's tools. The sledges, their runners polished smooth by use. The textiles, their colors faded, but their patterns still visible. Each object is a window into a world that no longer exists, a piece of evidence in the ongoing investigation of the past. The visitors themselves are part of the story. They come from around the world, drawn by the mystery of the Oseberg women and the beauty of their burial. They stand before the ship in silence, each person bringing their own questions and interpretations. Some see a monument to royal power, others a shrine to spiritual authority. Some are drawn by the artistic achievement, others by the human drama. All are touched by the weight of time, by the presence of the past in the present. The museum has also become a center for ongoing research. New analytical techniques are constantly being applied to the Oseberg materials, revealing details that were invisible to earlier generations of scholars. Microscopic analysis of the textiles has revealed information about their construction and use. Chemical analysis of the wood has provided insights into the ship's construction and the environment in which it was buried. Even the soil from the burial mound continues to yield information about the conditions under which the ship was interred. The conservation of the ship and its artifacts is an ongoing challenge. The transition from the stable environment of the burial to the fluctuating conditions of the museum has created new stresses on the materials. The wood expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity, causing cracks and warping. The textiles are fragile, their fibers weakened by centuries of burial. The metal objects are subject to corrosion, their surfaces slowly deteriorating despite careful treatment. Each year brings new discoveries as researchers find ways to extract more information from the Oseberg materials. Advanced imaging techniques reveal details that are invisible to the naked eye. The NI analysis of the organic materials provides information about the plants and animals that were part of the burial. Isotope analysis of the human remains offers clues about the women's diet and origins. The Oseberg ship continues to yield secrets, each new finding adding another piece to the puzzle of its meaning. The ship's influence extends far beyond the museum walls. It has inspired artists and writers, filmmakers, and musicians. Its image appears on everything from tourist postcards to national currency. It has become a symbol of Norwegian identity, a representation of the country's Viking heritage. But it has also transcended its national origins to become a universal symbol of the human desire to honor the dead and preserve memory. The debates about the identity of the Oseberg women continue, but they have evolved over the decades. Modern scholars are less concerned with assigning specific names to the remains than with understanding what the burial can tell us about Viking society as a whole. The ship has become a lens through which we can examine questions of gender, power, religion, and artistic achievement in the medieval world. The feminist scholarship of recent decades has brought new perspectives to the Oseberg burial. The obvious wealth and status of the women buried in the ship challenges traditional assumptions about the role of women in Viking society. These were clearly powerful individuals, leaders in their own right, rather than merely the wives or daughters of powerful men. Their burial suggests that women could achieve positions of authority and influence that were previously underestimated by historians. The international scholarly community has also brought new insights to the study of the Oseberg ship. Comparative studies with similar burials from other parts of the Viking world have revealed both commonalities and differences in burial practices. The ship has been placed in the context of broader European developments. Its influence is traced to sources as distant as the British Isles and the Byzantine Empire. The digital age has opened new possibilities for the study of the Oseberg materials. High-resolution photography allows for detailed examination of objects that are too fragile to handle. Three-dimensional scanning creates virtual models that can be manipulated and analyzed without risk to the originals. Online databases make the research accessible to scholars around the world, fostering new collaborations and discoveries. And as you imagine this, the ship resting under soft lighting, the faint echo of footsteps in the museum hall, remember that this was once a vessel of transition. It was meant to travel, to carry someone or something beyond the known world. The ship as a symbol of transition resonates across cultures and centuries. In Viking cosmology, ships were not just means of transportation, but were vehicles for traveling between worlds. The ship that carried the dead to the afterlife was as important as the ship that carried the living across the sea. The Oseberg ship was built for this ultimate voyage, its every detail designed to ensure safe passage to whatever lay beyond. The symbolism of the ship extends beyond death to encompass life itself. In a maritime culture, the ship was the most important tool for survival, the means by which communities connected with each other and with the resources they needed. The ship represented exploration, trade, and conquest, but also communication, exchange, and cooperation. It was simultaneously a weapon and a lifeline, a symbol of both power and vulnerability. The Oseberg ship embodies all of these meanings. Its construction shows the pinnacle of Viking shipbuilding technology. Its decoration reveals the heights of Viking artistic achievement. And its burial demonstrates the depths of Viking spiritual belief. It is a microcosm of an entire culture, a single object that contains multitudes. The ship's journey from active vessel to buried grave to museum exhibit is itself a story of transition. It has moved from the world of the living to the world of the dead to the world of memory. Each phase of its existence has revealed different aspects of its meaning, different facets of its significance. The ship that once carried the dead now carries the living into the past, serving as a bridge between then and now. The physical journey of the ship is also remarkable. Built in a royal workshop, it sailed the fjords of Norway before being selected for its final purpose. It was dragged over land to the burial site, its hull scraping against the earth as it made its last voyage. It was carefully positioned in the grave, its prow pointing toward the sea it would never see again. For over 1,000 years it rested in darkness, slowly being transformed by time and chemistry. Finally, it was lifted into the light, its secrets gradually revealed through decades of patient study. The ship's metaphorical journey is equally profound. It has traveled from history to legend to history again, its meaning constantly evolving as new generations of scholars and visitors encounter it. It has become a symbol of national identity, a tourist attraction, a work of art, and a scientific specimen. Each role reveals different aspects of its significance, different ways of understanding its place in human culture. Whoever the Oseberg women were, they were not forgotten, not entirely. Their ship tells us that they mattered, that they were mourned, that they were sent off not in silence, but in style. The enduring power of the Oseberg burial lies not in the specific identities of the women, but in what their commemoration reveals about the values of their society. They were honored not just with wealth, but with beauty, not just with objects, but with artistry. Their burial was a statement about the worth of human life, about the importance of memory, about the continuity between past and present. The ship itself has become a kind of time machine, carrying us back to a world that existed 1,000 years ago. Through its wood and metal, its textiles and tools, we can touch the lives of people who lived and died in a time so distant it might as well be another planet. Yet their concerns, their values, their hopes and fears remain recognizably human. The Oseberg women loved beauty, valued craftsmanship, and believed in the importance of proper burial. These are concerns that transcend time and culture, that connect us to the deepest aspects of human nature. The mystery of their identities may never be solved, but perhaps that is appropriate. In a world where so much is known, where information is constantly available, where privacy is increasingly rare, the Oseberg women maintain their secrets. They remind us that some things are beyond our understanding, that mystery can be as valuable as knowledge, that the unknown can be as meaningful as the known. Their silence speaks volumes. In a culture that valued oral tradition, that preserved history through stories and songs, the Oseberg women chose to communicate through objects rather than words. Their burial is a poem written in wood and metal, a story told through the arrangement of grave goods, a song sung in the language of craftsmanship and care. The ship that carried them into the afterlife now carries their memory into the future. Each visitor to the museum becomes part of their story. Each scholar who studies the remains adds to their legacy. They have achieved a kind of immortality, not through the preservation of their bodies, but through the preservation of their mystery. They remain present in their absence, powerful in their silence, memorable in their anonymity. The Oseberg burial continues to challenge our assumptions about the past. It reminds us that history is not a simple narrative, but a complex web of possibilities, that the people of the past were not crude precursors to ourselves, but were fully human beings with their own sophisticated cultures and beliefs. The ship is a window into a world that was different from ours, but recognizably human, a society that valued beauty, honored the dead, and believed in the importance of memory. The women who lie in the Oseberg ship have become more than historical figures. They have become symbols of the mystery of the past, representatives of all the people whose stories have been lost to time. Their burial speaks for the countless others who lived and died without leaving such magnificent memorials, whose lives were equally valuable, but whose deaths were less spectacularly commemorated. In the end, the Oseberg ship is about more than Viking history or archaeological discovery. It is about the human need to remember, to honor, to make meaning from the lives that came before us. The ship stands as testament to the complexity of human society, even in times we often dismiss as primitive or simple. The Vikings who created this burial were capable of extraordinary artistic achievement, sophisticated political organization, and profound spiritual belief. They understood that death was not an ending, but a transition, that memory was more powerful than mortality, that beauty could transcend time itself. The craftsmanship evident in every element of the burial speaks to a society that valued excellence for its own sake. The countless hours invested in carving the ship's decorations, weaving its textiles, and crafting its grave goods represent a commitment to quality that went far beyond mere functionality. These people believed that some things were worth doing perfectly, regardless of whether anyone would ever see the result. The ship's carvings were made to be buried. Its textiles were woven to decay. Yet the creators invested in them the same care they would have devoted to objects meant for daily use. This dedication to craft reveals something profound about Viking values. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, where violence and hardship were constant threats, the people who buried the Oseberg women chose to invest time and resources in creating beauty. They believed that art mattered, that craftsmanship was worth preserving, that the act of creation was itself a form of worship. The ship is a prayer rendered in wood and metal, a hymn sung in the language of human hands working with natural materials. The burial also reveals the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of symbolism. Every object in the grave was chosen for its meaning as well as its function. The ship itself was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of journey, transformation, and transcendence. The textiles were not just clothing, but representations of wealth, status, and artistic achievement. The tools were not just implements, but markers of identity and occupation. The animal bones were not just remnants of a feast, but offerings to the gods and symbols of abundance. This symbolic thinking extended to the burial's construction. The ship was positioned to face the sea, pointing toward the horizon and the unknown lands beyond. The women were arranged as though they were passengers on a voyage, their faces turned toward their destination. The grave goods were organized like the cargo of a real ship, everything in its proper place for the journey ahead. The entire burial was conceived as a functional vessel, designed to carry its passengers safely to their destination. The preservation of the Oseberg ship has given us an unprecedented glimpse into this symbolic world. We can see not just what the Vikings made, but how they thought. Not just their technologies, their philosophies. The ship is a three-dimensional manuscript, its every element carrying meaning that we are still learning to read. It challenges us to think beyond our own cultural assumptions, to imagine ways of understanding the world that are different from our own. The international connections revealed by the burial are equally remarkable. The silk ribbons came from the workshops of Byzantium, or even farther east, following trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and beyond. The artistic influences visible in the ship's decorations can be traced to sources throughout Europe, from the Celtic lands of Ireland and Scotland to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. The Vikings were not isolated barbarians, but were part of a cosmopolitan world that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. This cosmopolitan character adds another layer to the mystery of the Oseberg women. Were they local rulers who had accumulated wealth through trade and diplomacy? Were they foreign princesses who had married into Norwegian royal families? Were they representatives of international religious movements that connected the pagan world through shared beliefs and practices? The evidence supports all of these possibilities, and others besides. The ship's influence on modern culture is also significant. It has become an icon of Scandinavian identity, appearing on everything from tourist brochures to heavy metal album covers. It has inspired countless works of art, literature, and music, each generation finding new meanings in its ancient symbols. The ship has transcended its historical context to become a universal symbol of mystery, beauty, and the human desire to honor the dead. The ongoing conservation of the ship presents its own challenges and rewards. Each year brings new techniques for preserving the ancient materials, new ways of extracting information from objects that seem to have revealed all their secrets. The ship is simultaneously an artifact from the past and a work of art in the present, requiring the skills of archaeologists, conservators, artists, and scientists to maintain its integrity and accessibility. The ethical questions surrounding the display of human remains have also evolved over the decades. The Oseberg women were buried with the expectation that they would rest undisturbed, yet their remains have become objects of scientific study and public display. Modern museums struggle with the balance between research and respect, between education and exploitation. The ship raises questions about who owns the past and how we should relate to the dead. The digital preservation of the Oseberg materials offers new possibilities for access and study. High-resolution scans allow researchers around the world to examine details that would be impossible to see in person. Virtual reality reconstructions let visitors experience the burial as it might have appeared to the original mourners. Online databases make the ship's treasures available to anyone with an internet connection, democratizing access to knowledge that was once available only to specialists. The ship has also become a tool for understanding climate change and environmental history. Analysis of the wood reveals information about ancient weather patterns and forest composition. Study of the preserved organic materials provides data about diet, agriculture, and ecology in the Viking Age. The ship serves as a time capsule, not just of human culture, but of the natural world that supported it. The feminist interpretation of the burial has opened new avenues of research and understanding. The obvious power and status of the Oseberg women challenge traditional narratives about gender roles in medieval society. They suggest that women could achieve positions of authority and influence that have been underestimated by historians focused on male-dominated sources. The ship becomes evidence for a more complex and nuanced understanding of gender in the Viking world. The religious significance of the burial continues to be debated and reinterpreted. Some scholars see evidence of Christian influence in the burial practices, suggesting that the conversion of Scandinavia began earlier than traditionally believed. Others argue for continuity with pagan traditions, seeing the ship as a manifestation of pre-Christian beliefs about death and the afterlife. The burial probably represents a synthesis of influences, a moment of transition when old and new beliefs coexisted and influenced each other. The ship's role as a vehicle for the imagination is perhaps its most important function in the modern world. It allows us to travel back in time, to experience the past through our senses as well as our intellects. Standing before the ship in the museum, visitors can almost hear the sound of oars cutting through water, almost smell the salt spray and tar, almost feel the roll of the deck beneath their feet. The ship makes history tangible, transforming abstract knowledge into immediate experience. The mystery of the Oseberg women may never be fully solved, but that is part of their enduring appeal. They represent the unknowable past, the people whose stories have been lost to time, the questions that will never be answered. They remind us that history is not a complete narrative, but a collection of fragments. That much of the past remains mysterious and unknowable. They challenge us to embrace uncertainty, to find meaning in questions as well as answers. The ship that carried them into death now carries us into understanding. Through its wood and metal, its textiles and tools, we touch the lives of people who lived 1,000 years ago. We see their values reflected in their choices, their beliefs embodied in their actions, their hopes expressed in their art. The Oseberg women speak to us across the centuries, not through words, but through the language of objects, the vocabulary of craftsmanship, the grammar of care and attention that transforms mere things into meaning. Their burial was meant to ensure their safe passage to the afterlife, but it has achieved something perhaps more remarkable. It has ensured their passage into our world, their continued presence in our consciousness, their ongoing influence on our understanding of the past. They have achieved a form of immortality, not through the preservation of their bodies, but through the preservation of their mystery, their beauty, their representation of human dignity and worth. And now, as we leave the silent halls where their ship rests, as we step away from the mystery of their identities and the beauty of their burial, we must turn our attention to another aspect of Viking life, one that reveals different truths about power and society. For while the Oseberg women wielded influence through wealth and ceremony, through art and symbolism, there were others who built their authority on different foundations entirely. The ship burial shows us one face of Viking leadership, refined and elegant, mysterious and beautiful. But leadership in the medieval world required more than ceremony and symbolism. It demanded the ability to gather followers, to build alliances, to maintain loyalty in a world where betrayal could mean death and success could disappear overnight. The great halls of Viking chieftains were theaters of power where politics and hospitality intertwined, where the bonds of loyalty were forged not just through fear, but through the more subtle ties of obligation, generosity, and shared identity. From the quiet mystery of a ship entombed in earth, we turn now to the raucous energy of the mead hall, where power was displayed not through silent grandeur, but through the deliberate orchestration of plenty, the careful management of relationships, and the constant negotiation between leader and led that kept. Viking society functioning in an age without kings or formal government. It is time to explore how Viking chieftains maintained their grip on power, not through force alone, but through the more complex and sophisticated mechanisms of feast and favor, the bonds of loyalty that held their world together, even as it expanded across continents and oceans. The Oseberg women may have ruled through mystery and magnificence, but the chieftains of the great halls built their authority on foundations that were both more visible and more precarious. The willing allegiance of warriors who could choose to follow or to walk away, taking their swords and their loyalty to another lord who might prove more generous, more successful, or simply more worthy of their trust. Instead of ruling through sheer force, Viking chieftains maintained power through a sophisticated web of social obligations, generosity, and carefully managed relationships. They understood that loyalty was not a given. It was earned and constantly reinforced. This delicate dance of power played out in the heart of the Viking world, the mead hall, the thing, and the quiet obligations of loyalty. When we envision Viking leaders, the immediate image that often comes to mind is one of formidable warriors, ruling with an iron fist and a sharpened axe. We picture them leading charges, their strength and ferocity inspiring fear and obedience. While their martial prowess was undoubtedly a crucial aspect of their authority, it was far from the sole determinant of their power. Especially in Scandinavia and Iceland, where centralized kingdoms were either nascent or entirely absent, chieftains wielded influence, not just by the might of their sword arm, but by a more nuanced approach centered on favors, feasts, and the meticulous cultivation of loyalty. Their rule was a delicate balance, a constant negotiation between being generous and maintaining firm control. Imagine yourself immersed in the rich, smoky atmosphere of a chieftain's great hall, the very pulse of his homestead. The air is thick with the inviting aromas of roasted meat and sweet mead, drifting tantalizingly from the glowing hearth at the center of the room. This fire, the heart of the home, casts dancing shadows on the wooden benches lining the walls, worn smooth by generations of use. Above, shields, polished and gleaming, hang like trophies, each one a silent testament to past service, hard-won battles, and unwavering allegiance. Around you, free men are gathered farmers whose hands are calloused from the soil, warriors whose gazes are sharp and watchful, traders whose minds are always calculating. Some chew slowly, savoring the richness of the food, while others listen intently, their expressions a respectful blend of deference and shrewd assessment. They are not here as mere subjects, cowering before a tyrannical ruler. They are here as allies, as followers, and in a profound way, as equals. This was the fundamental principle by which Viking chieftains solidified and maintained their authority, by consistently giving more than they took. Power within the Viking world was an intensely personal affair, devoid of the impersonal structures that characterize modern governance. There were no sprawling bureaucracies to enforce decrees, no standing armies to quell dissent with overwhelming force, no dedicated jails to house offenders. A chieftain did not govern through edicts issued from a distant throne. Instead, his influence stemmed from his ability to persuade, to reward, and crucially, to remember. He kept meticulous mental ledgers of names, of debts incurred and obligations fulfilled, and of deeds both valorous and mundane. Loyalty was not an inherent trait or an automatic consequence of birthright. It was a dynamic force that had to be painstakingly earned, day after day, through a continuous cycle of ritualized gift-giving, through the magnificent spectacle of a generous feast, and through the slow, deliberate construction of trust. The feast was absolutely central to this intricate process. It was far more than a mere social gathering. It was a potent statement, a public declaration of a chieftain's wealth, generosity, and influence. The unspoken truth was that a well-fed follower was, almost by definition, a loyal one. At these lavish gatherings, the chieftain would offer an abundance of roasted meats, flowing mead, and the stirring sounds of music, often provided by skalds, poets who sang of heroic deeds and ancestral glories. In return, he received something far more valuable than coin: pledges of unwavering support, the kind of loyalty that could withstand the hardships of a long winter or the rigors of battle. During lean winters, when hunger gnawed at communities, the chieftain who could still provide ample food from his meticulously managed stores was not merely seen as fortunate. He was perceived as blessed, powerful, even chosen by the gods themselves. His ability to sustain his people through times of scarcity was a direct manifestation of his divine favor and immense earthly power. But the feast's significance extended beyond mere sustenance. It was about visibility. The chieftain, at the head of the table, was literally and figuratively at the center of his community. It was about influence, a subtle yet pervasive demonstration of who held the reins of provision and prosperity, reminding everyone present who could provide, and by stark contrast, who could not. And when the revelry of the feast eventually subsided and the last echoes of laughter faded, the loyalty cultivated during those hours held profound weight. Viking society operated on a foundation of oath solemn, verbal agreements exchanged face to face, often solidified with a shared drink from a communal horn or a firm clasping of hands. These were not light-hearted promises to be casually broken. The repercussions of oath-breaking were severe and far-reaching. An oath-breaker was not simply disliked or ostracized. They were considered dangerous, fundamentally untrustworthy, a direct threat to the fragile social order that bound the community together. In this world, reputation was not merely important. It was everything. A chieftain's reputation, therefore, had to be impeccable. He needed to be renowned not only for his bravery in battle, but also for his fairness in judgment, his boundless generosity, and, when circumstances allowed, his even-tempered demeanor. A reputation for impulsive anger or stinginess could erode loyalty far more effectively than any defeat on the battlefield. Justice, too, was an integral and often demanding aspect of the chieftain's multifaceted role. Disputes were settled publicly at the Thing, a unique open-air assembly that functioned as both a legislative body and a court of law. The chieftain did not preside over the Thing as a solitary, omnipotent ruler handing down arbitrary decrees. Instead, he acted as a guide, a respected voice, and a crucial balancer of competing interests. He understood that he could not afford to be perceived as biased or to openly play favorites. Such actions were fraught with risk, for a wrong decision, one seen as unjust or self-serving, could cost him not just a single follower, but an entire faction, potentially leading to widespread unrest or even open rebellion. Consequently, the chieftain navigated these assemblies with immense care and strategic foresight. He listened patiently to grievances, sifting through layers of accusation and counter-accusation. He heard testimony from all sides, weighing the evidence with a keen understanding of human nature and local custom. And sometimes, to maintain peace and prevent a simmering dispute from escalating into a violent feud, he would offer restitution directly from his own stores, be it silver, livestock, or valuable goods. These acts were never interpreted as signs of weakness or capitulation. On the contrary, they were perceived as shrewd investments in civility, tangible demonstrations of his commitment to the well-being of his community. Power in the Viking world was inherently fragile, a delicate edifice that could crumble under the weight of unresolved conflict. The wisest chieftains possessed the acute foresight to understand when to bend, when to make concessions, when to absorb a small loss to prevent a catastrophic break. Their flexibility was a sign of strength, not infirmity. Land, while seemingly a straightforward source of power, also operated under a distinct set of Viking-era principles. While the chieftains certainly owned significant tracts of land, the right to use that land was often far more valuable and potent than mere ownership. By granting grazing rights for livestock, or access to vital resources like timber from forests or rich pasturage, a chieftain could forge powerful bonds with others without relinquishing ultimate ownership of the land itself. A farmer who relied on a chieftain's woodland for timber to repair his longhouse or graze his cattle would naturally be more inclined to fight alongside that chieftain in times of conflict, or to lend him crucial support at the next thing. Control, in this context, wasn't about rigid fences or precise property lines. It was about permission, about a pervasive and benevolent presence, about continually ensuring that your name remained prominently in people's minds as the one who provided them with something essential, something they needed to thrive. Even seemingly simple gifts were imbued with layers of political meaning. A meticulously crafted sword presented to a promising young warrior was not merely a present. It was a potent reminder of the chieftain's generosity and an unspoken expectation of future service. A finely woven cloak, shimmering with intricate patterns, was more than just a token of appreciation. It was a powerful signal that someone had been noticed, valued, and perhaps, subtly, expected to return the favor at some opportune moment. These gifts were tangible threads in the chieftain's carefully woven web of reciprocal obligations. Women, though often relegated to a less visible public role, played subtle yet profoundly important parts in this intricate social structure. A well-chosen marriage for a daughter could forge crucial alliances between two influential families, cementing bonds that could last for generations and prevent feuds. A chieftain's wife, often a woman of considerable intelligence and social acumen, might host important feasts herself, skillfully mediating quarrels between rival factions, or meticulously maintaining the complex web of social ties that underpinned her husband's authority. The Norse sagas are replete with examples of powerful women who advised their husbands, subtly persuaded influential men, and expertly managed the sprawling households that formed the economic and social bedrock of their husbands' power. In Iceland, a society notably devoid of kings, where chieftains held undisputed sway, this kind of quiet, often unseen, influence wielded by women was not just helpful. It was absolutely essential to maintaining stability and order. Yet, despite these sophisticated strategies, not all chieftains succeeded in perpetuating their power. Those who succumbed to greed, who demanded too much from their followers without reciprocation, or who simply failed to share their wealth, invariably found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Or, worse still, they found themselves openly challenged. Viking society possessed its own brutal, yet often effective, mechanism for the removal of an unfit leader, the feud. If a man, particularly a chieftain, proved untrustworthy, if he consistently failed to uphold his end of the social contract, others would eventually take justice into their own hands. The sagas, those invaluable historical and literary treasures, are filled with countless tales where a seemingly minor insult, an unpaid debt, or a forgotten obligation tragically spiraled into devastating bloodshed, tearing families and communities apart. Thus, the wisest chieftains were master orchestrators, not just of people and resources, but of human emotions. They possessed an uncanny ability to read the room, to gauge the prevailing mood of an assembly or a gathering. They instinctively knew when to extend generosity, when to speak with authority, and perhaps most crucially, when to step back and allow tensions to dissipate. A single well-timed feast could soothe months of simmering resentment and friction. Conversely, a single ill-considered insult, a moment of perceived disrespect, could unravel years of painstaking alliance building. In a profound sense, these chieftains were diplomats, long before the concept of nation-states existed. They were strategists operating without the benefit of formal maps or military academies. And their most potent tools were not merely axes and longbows, but the subtle power of promises and the enduring balm of praise. As night deepened over the chieftain's homestead, and the hearth fire slowly began to burn low, a successful chieftain would sit quietly in the flickering light. He would listen to the fading strains of the skald songs, watching his great hall slowly empty as his guests departed. He would measure the success of the night not in mere hours passed, but in the favors exchanged, the bonds reinforced. He would mentally tally who came, who lingered to share a final drink, who offered a genuine smile, and most importantly, who pledged their acts for the coming spring campaigns. Each guest who departed was a vital thread in the intricate web of loyalty he painstakingly wove. Each gift given and received was a knot, securing that thread more firmly. And in the subsequent silence, when the songs had finally ended, and the wooden benches creaked softly beneath the weight of a few sleeping bodies, he would experience a profound, if fleeting, sense of peace. He would know, with a quiet certainty, that his power still held. For now, the intricate social fabric of the Viking world, woven with threads of personal loyalty and reciprocal obligation, found its strength and resilience in these very human interactions. The Mead Hall was not merely a place of revelry. It was a stage where political theater unfolded, where alliances were forged and reaffirmed, and where the chieftain's authority was constantly tested and displayed. Every shared meal, every shared horn of mead, every jest and every song contributed to the collective memory and reinforced the bonds that held the community together. The chieftain, at the heart of it all, was not just a leader, but a living embodiment of the social contract, a promise of protection and prosperity in exchange for allegiance. Consider the role of the Huskarls, the chieftain's personal guard and closest retinue. These were men of proven loyalty and skill, often drawn from respected families, who lived within the chieftain's household. They were fed, clothed, and armed by him, serving as his sworn bodyguards, enforcers of his will, and the core of any raiding party or army he might raise. Their loyalty was intensely personal, a direct result of the chieftain's generosity and the shared dangers they faced. They were his inner circle, his most trusted companions, and their very presence underscored his power and his ability to provide for a formidable fighting force. Beyond the Huskarls, layers of allegiance extended to freemen, independent farmers, and craftsmen who owned their land but looked to the chieftain for protection, justice, and leadership in times of crisis. These were the men who comprised the bulk of the Thing attendees, their voices a vital, albeit often contentious, part of the chieftain's political landscape. Their support was crucial, and their willingness to follow him into battle, to contribute to a collective endeavor, was a direct measure of his prestige and their trust in his leadership. Even the thralls, the unfree members of society contributed to the chieftain's standing. While their labor was coerced, a chieftain who managed his thralls efficiently, and in some rare instances, offered them a path to freedom, further demonstrated his prosperity and the breadth of his domain. The more thralls, the greater the chieftain's wealth and capacity for production, which, in turn, supported his ability to host lavish feasts and provide for his free followers. The very concept of the herd, or a chieftain's retinue, highlights this reliance on personal bonds. It was not a rigid military hierarchy in the modern sense, but a flexible group of sworn companions who derived their status and well-being from their connection to the chieftain. Their reputation was intrinsically linked to his, and their willingness to fight and die for him was a direct testament to the strength of their oath. These were the men who would accompany him on trading voyages, raid foreign shores, and defend his homestead from rivals. Their existence was a constant reminder of the chieftain's magnetic pull, his ability to attract and maintain a loyal following through a combination of charisma, generosity, and the promise of shared glory and plunder. The weight of an oath in Viking society cannot be overstated. It was a sacred bond, often invoked with the names of the gods Odin, Thor, Freya, and witnessed by the community. To break an oath was not merely a social misstep. It was an act of profound dishonor, a spiritual transgression that could bring ill fortune not just upon the individual, but upon their entire family. An oathbreaker was an Ulfhuan, an outlaw, a pariah whose word could never be trusted and whose life could be taken with impunity. This deep-seated cultural reverence for oaths served as a powerful social glue, enforcing agreements in a world without formal legal enforcement agencies. For a chieftain, his word was his bond, his most valuable currency. Any perceived dishonesty or failure to uphold an oath could shatter his reputation, leading to a swift loss of followers and an inevitable decline in power. Hence, the careful cultivation of a reputation for unwavering integrity was paramount. It was not enough to be strong. One had to be honorable. The thing itself was a cornerstone of Viking social and political life. It was a democratic, albeit often tumultuous, assembly where free men gathered to make laws, resolve disputes, and collectively decide on matters of war and peace. Held in designated, often sacred, outdoor locations, the thing was an exercise in public discourse and negotiation. The chieftain's role here was less that of a monarch and more that of a skilled arbiter and orator. He would stand on the Lagberg or Lawrock, a designated speaking place, and listen to the arguments, weighing the testimonies, and then, crucially, offering guidance. He had to possess sharp legal acumen, a deep understanding of customary law, and the rhetorical skill to sway public opinion. He could not simply impose his will. He had to persuade, cajole, and sometimes compromise. The decision of the thing was binding, and the chieftain's ability to guide it towards a favorable outcome for himself and his allies was a testament to his political prowess. His fairness in these proceedings was constantly under scrutiny, as any hint of bias could undermine his authority and alienate powerful families, potentially sparking a feud. This constant public accountability made chieftaincy a precarious balancing act, demanding constant vigilance and a keen understanding of social dynamics. The offering of restitution, whether silver or livestock, within the context of the thing or a private dispute, was a crucial tool in the chieftain's arsenal. It was a tangible demonstration of his commitment to peace and stability, and a way to avert the ruinous cycle of vengeance. In a society without state-enforced police or prisons, personal retribution, the feud, was the primary mechanism for justice. By providing compensation, the chieftain stepped in as a peacemaker, absorbing the economic cost himself to prevent further bloodshed and maintain the fragile peace within his sphere of influence. These were not acts of weakness, but strategic investments in the long-term viability of his power base. A chieftain who could consistently prevent feuds through such means was seen as wise, capable, and truly powerful, for he ensured the continued prosperity and security of his people. The economic foundations of a chieftain's power extended beyond mere ownership of land. While owning fertile fields and prime pastures was important, control over the use of resources was often more strategically valuable. Granting access to valuable timber for shipbuilding or house construction, allowing followers to hunt in his forests or fish in his rivers, created a network of reciprocal dependence. These were tangible benefits that bound individuals to him in ways that mere political promises could not. A farmer who relied on the chieftain for access to shared resources would think twice before challenging his authority or siding with a rival. It was a system of indirect control, less about direct ownership and more about the power of granting permission, about his omnipresent influence in the daily lives of his followers. His name became synonymous with opportunity and access, a silent testament to his far-reaching authority. The politics of giving extended deeply into all aspects of Viking social interaction. A sword given to a young man might be an heirloom, passed down through generations, symbolizing the chieftain's trust and the recipient's entry into the warrior class. It was an investment in the future, a hope that the young man would honor the gift by serving valiantly. A woven cloak, crafted from fine wool and perhaps dyed with rare pigments, signaled not only the chieftain's generosity, but also the recipient's elevated status within his retinue. These were not simply material possessions. They were physical manifestations of social bonds, reminders of obligations, and signals of patronage. The act of giving created an immediate debt, an expectation of reciprocity that might be fulfilled through military service, political support, or a reciprocal gift of equal or greater value at a later date. This intricate exchange of gifts and countergifts formed the bedrock of the Viking economy of prestige, where social capital was as valuable as silver. The sagas, the epic tales of Icelandic and Norwegian families, offer invaluable insights into the subtle yet profound roles women played in this male-dominated society. While they rarely wielded axes in battle or spoke from the Lagberg at the Thing, their influence was often the unseen current that propelled or undermined a chieftain's power. A well-married daughter was a strategic asset, her union a political alliance that could bring powerful kin into a chieftain's sphere of influence, securing peace or providing crucial military aid. Wives, as mistresses of the household, managed vast domestic economies, overseeing the thralls, the production of food, textiles, and other necessities. Their ability to manage these complex logistical operations directly enabled the chieftain to host the lavish feasts that were so central to his power. More than that, they were often skilled negotiators and conciliators, able to soothe quarrels among male family members, mediate disputes, and maintain the intricate web of social ties that were constantly strained by rivalries and ambition. Figures like Gudrun Ovisdottir or Holgerd Longlegs from the Icelandic sagas demonstrate women who were fiercely intelligent, strategically minded, and capable of influencing events through their counsel, their alliances, and their unwavering will. Their influence, though often expressed through domestic and social channels, was fundamental to the stability and prosperity of the chieftain's domain. In a land like Iceland, where formalized kingship was absent, the power of these women in their households, and through their carefully cultivated networks, was not just helpful. It was utterly essential to the maintenance of social order. However, despite these sophisticated mechanisms for control, the Viking world was a volatile one, and the chieftain's position was never entirely secure. Those who failed to grasp the delicate balance between generosity and self-interest, who grew greedy and hoarded their wealth, or who simply neglected their followers, invariably saw their power wane. A chieftain who demanded too much tribute, who failed to share the spoils of a successful raid, or who neglected to host regular feasts, would soon find his retinue dwindling, his influence eroding, and his former allies turning into rivals. Or worse, he would face direct challenge. Viking society had a brutal but effective mechanism for dealing with perceived injustice or an incompetent leader: the feud. The feud was a blood debt, a cycle of reciprocal violence that could engulf families and communities for generations. If a man, even a chieftain, could not be trusted to uphold the social contract, if he betrayed an oath or committed an egregious act, his kin would be obligated to take justice into their own hands. This could involve direct vengeance, raiding his property, or even assassinating him. The sagas are filled with stark, chilling examples of how a single insult, an unpaid debt, a forgotten obligation, or a perceived slight could spiral into a cascade of violence. The lack of a strong centralized authority meant that individuals and families were largely responsible for defending their honor and avenging wrongs. A chieftain who was unable to manage these feuds, either by mediating or by demonstrating sufficient strength to deter aggression, would quickly lose credibility and control. This constant threat of feud ensured that chieftains remained acutely aware of their social obligations and the need to maintain a pristine reputation. Therefore, the wisest chieftains were not just warriors or administrators. They were astute psychologists and master managers of human emotion. They understood the subtle currents of discontent and satisfaction that flowed through their community. They possessed an almost intuitive ability to read the room at a gathering, to discern underlying tensions, and to gauge the mood of their followers. They knew when to extend generosity to soothe frayed nerves, when to speak with commanding authority to quell dissent, and crucially, when to step back and allow time to heal wounds. A single well-timed feast, rich with food and camaraderie, could resolve months of simmering tension and avert potential conflict. Conversely, a single thoughtless insult, a moment of public humiliation, could undo years of painstakingly built alliances, turning friends into bitter enemies. In a very real sense, these chieftains were diplomats long before the concept of nations or international relations existed. They were strategists, plotting their moves on a human chessboard without the aid of formal maps or military academies. Their most potent tools were not just their axes and their sleek longboats, but the subtle power of promises, the healing balm of praise, and the quiet threat of their displeasure. As the northern night deepened, wrapping the homestead in its cool embrace, and the hearth fire at the center of the hall slowly burned down to embers, a successful chieftain would find himself in a moment of quiet reflection. He would sit, perhaps listening to the last fading echoes of a song, or the gentle snoring of a few remaining loyal companions who had fallen asleep on the benches. He would watch his great hall slowly empty, each departing guest a thread in the intricate web of loyalty he had painstakingly woven throughout the evening. He would measure the night's success, not by the passage of hours, but by the favors exchanged, the bonds reinforced, and the quiet, unspoken assurances given. He would mentally tally who had come, who had lingered to share a final horn of mead, who had offered a genuine smile of camaraderie, and, most importantly, who had pledged their acts, their unwavering support for the coming spring campaigns or future endeavors. Each guest who departed was a vital thread in the elaborate tapestry of his power. Each gift given and received, each word exchanged was a knot, securing that thread more firmly. And in that subsequent silence, when the last songs had ended and the sturdy wooden benches creaked softly beneath the weight of a few sleeping bodies, he would experience a profound, if fleeting, sense of peace. He would know, with a quiet, almost primal certainty, that his power still held. For now, the chieftain's authority, therefore, was a constantly negotiated reality, a dynamic interplay between his personal qualities, his material wealth, and his ability to navigate the complex social currents of his time. It was a power that was always in flux, always requiring maintenance, always susceptible to challenge. Yet, it was precisely this fluid, personal nature of Viking leadership that allowed for such remarkable adaptability and expansion. The same principles of feasting, gift-giving, and oath-taking that held communities together in Scandinavia also underpinned the audacious voyages across the North Atlantic, the establishment of new settlements in Iceland and Greenland, and the temporary, yet impactful, presence in North America. The chieftain who could command loyalty in his home, Hall was the same man who could inspire his followers to brave unknown seas and confront new challenges in distant lands. This intricate system of power, based on personal bonds rather than impersonal institutions, also explains the inherent decentralization of Viking society. While powerful individuals emerged, often establishing hereditary lines, there was rarely a single overarching authority that could command absolute obedience across vast territories. Instead, power was localized, held by a multitude of chieftains, each with their own sphere of influence, constantly vying for prestige and followers. This competitive environment further amplified the importance of the chieftain's ability to attract and retain loyalty, as rivals were always seeking to draw away his support through superior generosity, more compelling leadership, or a more fearsome reputation. The sagas are rife with accounts of such power struggles, betrayals, and shifting alliances, underscoring the precariousness of even the most established chieftain's position. Furthermore, the spiritual dimension of a chieftain's power cannot be overlooked. While not priests, chieftains often performed sacrifices and rituals, acting as intermediaries between their community and the gods. Their ability to ensure a good harvest, a successful raid, or favorable winds for a voyage was often attributed to their perceived favor with Odin, Thor, or Freya. A chieftain who consistently brought prosperity and victory to his people was seen as blessed by the divine, further solidifying his authority and enhancing his charisma. Conversely, a chieftain who suffered repeated failures might be perceived as having lost the favor of the gods, leading to a decline in his prestige and a weakening of his hold on power. This spiritual dimension added another layer of complexity to the chieftain's role, demanding not just political acumen and martial skill, but also a perceived connection to the supernatural forces that governed their world. The rituals performed in the mead hall, the sacrifices offered before a journey, and the invocations made before battle were all integral parts of maintaining this divine legitimacy. The very architecture of the longhouse, with its central hearth and communal sleeping arrangements, facilitated this constant social interaction. It was a space designed for gathering, for storytelling, for shared meals, and for the informal negotiation of social hierarchies. There was little privacy, meaning that a chieftain's actions and character were constantly on public display, reinforcing the importance of his reputation. Every gesture, every word, every decision was observed and interpreted by his followers, contributing to the overall perception of his wisdom, fairness, and generosity. This transparency, while potentially challenging, also served to strengthen legitimate power as it allowed followers to personally witness and affirm their chieftain's worthiness. The importance of frith, or peace and protection within the community, was another critical aspect of a chieftain's responsibility. His role was to maintain internal harmony, ensuring that disputes did not escalate into uncontrollable feuds that could decimate his following. This often involved complex legal maneuverings, such as offering arbitration, arranging compensation, or even, in extreme cases, banishing individuals who posed a threat to the community's peace. The sagas illustrate how chieftains navigated these treacherous waters, sometimes successfully preserving peace, and at other times failing spectacularly, leading to bloodshed and the unraveling of their authority. The ability to guarantee frith was a powerful incentive for freemen to align themselves with the chieftain, as it promised a degree of stability and security in an otherwise turbulent world. The wealth of a chieftain, crucial for hosting feasts and giving gifts, came from a variety of sources. Raids and plunder from foreign lands were certainly a significant contributor, bringing in silver, goods, and thralls. However, trade was equally, if not more, important. Chieftains often controlled trade routes, owned trading ships, and acted as merchants themselves, accumulating wealth through the exchange of goods like furs, amber, iron, and slaves. Agriculture and animal husbandry on their estates also provided a steady income, allowing them to provision their households and their followers. The control over resources, both acquired through raiding and through more peaceful economic endeavors, was the material foundation upon which their social power was built. A chieftain's success in these ventures directly impacted his ability to maintain his network of loyal followers, as economic prosperity was a tangible benefit he could offer. So, as we conclude this journey through the nuanced world of Viking chieftaincy, moving beyond the simple image of the brute warrior, we see a far more complex and captivating figure. We find leaders who were masters of social engineering, adept at the art of persuasion, and deeply invested in the personal relationships that formed the very bedrock of their power. They ruled not from a distant throne, but from the heart of their community, in the smoky warmth of the mead hall, through the solemnity of oaths, and under the watchful eyes of their loyal followers. Their leadership was a constant performance, a delicate dance between giving and receiving, commanding and compromising, asserting strength and demonstrating fairness. It was a system that, while seemingly archaic, proved remarkably effective in organizing societies, launching daring expeditions, and ultimately shaping a significant chapter in European history. And with that understanding of their intricate control, of how they bound their people, not just by force, but by warmth, by generosity, and by shared purpose, we can now turn our gaze outward. For these same chieftains, these same networks of loyalty, these very ships that brought them riches and renown, also carried them beyond the known world, into uncharted waters where new challenges, new discoveries, and new destinies awaited. What drove them to leave the comfort of their longhouses and face the terrifying unknown? What whispers from the waves beckoned them further, towards lands unseen and adventures untold? The sagas speak of such journeys, of courage and desperation, of the lure of the horizon, and of the profound changes that awaited them far from the familiar shores of home. And now, the fire has burned low, and our journey through the Viking world comes quietly to its end. We've wandered through frozen longhouses, where the wind slipped through wooden walls, and time passed slowly in the hush of winter. We've stepped into the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, a man of fierce words and colder seasons, and followed his story through grief, poetry, and the distant echo of clashing oaths. We've stood beside the curved hull of the Oseberg ship, marveling at the mystery of two women sent into the afterlife with care and ceremony. And we've lingered in mead halls, where power was not shouted, but offered gently, in the form of warmth, food, and memory. All of it bound together by the rhythm of the North, a place where silence mattered, where survival was an art, and leadership meant knowing when to speak, and when simply to listen. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as raiders, all fire and fury. But tonight we saw another side, a slower, more human view. The steady weaving of cloth by firelight, the gentle hush of snowfall on a sod roof, the murmur of an oath made over a carved drinking horn. These were lives not defined by war alone, but by waiting, watching, enduring, and remembering. As you begin to drift now, let your thoughts move like falling snow, quiet, soft, and without urgency. There's no need to recall each name or scene. Only the feeling that history isn't always in the noise of conquest, but in the stillness between storms. The patience of dark winters. The comfort of a familiar story shared by the hearth. Let that stillness carry you. The creak of timber in a buried ship. The slow beat of verses once recited in smoke-filled halls. The faint trace of footsteps over frost. Thank you for spending this time in the past. Wherever you are tonight, and however the world feels outside your window, may your rest be deep, and your dreams gently touched by the stories we leave behind. We'll return soon with another chapter from long ago. Until then, sleep well and drift softly.